This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
2 minutes after 10 is the time. Boris Johnson there congratulating Nick Ferrari on holding the powerful to account. I mean, who wouldn't shed a tear, honestly, in those circumstances? We stay with politics this morning, and we turn our attention first to the man I think likely to be the next Prime Minister. We can probably all agree about that. And I think a rather a sort of grim sense that this looming general election is going to be pretty hideous. And the weirdest thing about it is that I think Rishi Sunak would quite like to fight an election on Keir Starmer's terms. I think two technocrats setting out relatively detailed, and of course as election day approaches or as manifestos are published, the detail becomes clearer and more important. But two relative technocrats, I think Rishi Sunak, despite having turned out to be rather bad at politics, can still be fairly described as a technocrat, setting out the almost the equations, the algebra of politics with which they intend to change the country. That's a good word, isn't it? The algebra of politics. It's like a sort of battle of formulae. I will do this and he will do the opposite, if you like, of populism, which of course Keir Starmer criticised yesterday. The precise opposite of populism, which is just either a promise to be terrible to some people you've been persuaded to be frightened of or persuaded not to like, or it is sort of apple pie tomorrow and mythical bonuses around the corner. Vote for me. Well, like Brexit. Brexit would be the essence of populism, wouldn't it, in 21st century British politics? Millions and millions of people persuaded to vote for more money, to vote for a lower cost of living, better NHS. Some people thought they'd get less immigration. Every single promise made was, to anybody really paying attention, with the possible exception of the immigration one, every single promise made was obviously, to anyone properly informed, going to be broken. And yet, here we are. 8 years later, still counting the costs. Some stories in the news this week about imminent problems about to be introduced as a direct consequence of everybody knowing exactly what they were voting for. So populism is not something that comes naturally to either Starmer or Sunak, and yet Sunak seems to have boxed himself into a corner whereby he's going to have to fight the next election as a sort of culture war. He's going to have to surround himself with deeply unpleasant people whose only skill, for want of a better word, is lobbing manure at their opponents. In what possible universe you would see 30p Lee Anderson as an electoral asset is not a universe that Rishi Sunak really wants to be living in. I'm not quite sure where we're going with this, actually. I came on air wanting to talk about Keir Starmer, but the more I start pontificating and pondering, the more I wonder whether we're going to do a sort of State of the Nation phone-in first up this morning. I want to go into it through Keir Starmer. He was on with Nick earlier, but he does a good job in that slot. He generally sort of keeps things cool. And what I want to know from you this morning is whether or not Keir Starmer's perceived dullness. I want a better word than dullness, don't I? I mean, what is the word that you want? What is a nice way of describing somebody who is sober? Soberness? Sobriety? Does that work for it? No? Sometimes when I do this, I am looking at the faces of my colleagues. I'm not just sort of having an imaginary conversation with imaginary people. Sobriety doesn't quite work, does it? Because, automatically you start thinking about booze, which is unhelpful. I don't think he is dull. I think he is interesting in the sense that he says interesting things, but he doesn't sort of jump up and down and make the political equivalent of balloon animals when he's being interviewed and say stupid things that make some people laugh and other people retch. So I want to know whether that is becoming an electoral asset. I think perhaps it is. But I cannot lie to you. I'm so keen to see the back of the last 14 years of utterly unnecessary and self-inflicted national decline that I possibly suffer from a touch of the rose-tinted spectacles. I'm interested in your relationship, your political relationship with Keir Starmer. Stayed is good. I quite like stayed from Sarah. I don't like square. I don't like steady. Steady's good. Steady, stayed, steady. Something else that begins with ST. Stayed, steady. Something else. I think it now is becoming a positive where previously it was a negative. I've said to you on a few occasions, I wish he'd find some stardust. I wish he'd sort of start reaching the parts that other politicians cannot reach. But the more I see him being interviewed and the more I look at some of the detail that's emerging, the more I find myself wondering whether this is going to actually prove to be a positive. Serious and erudite. They're strong words, but I wouldn't earnest. That's really interesting that these words are coming in. Melin Harrogate swims the other way. She says uninspiring. But then you'd have to tell me what you mean by inspiring. Steady is coming in a lot. Somber. Liam in York says sensible. Steadying is good. Sincerity, James, says Matt. It says this apparent lack of charisma is not a negative. Charisma's a very weird thing, isn't it? It's a bit like loyalty. Do you know, as I get older, that things that I've always presumed were positives, I begin to wonder whether they really are. Loyalty may sound like an odd thing to question, but if your loyalty blinds you to, if your loyalty prevents you from seeing the truth. I look at, sometimes loyalty is vanity, isn't it? People who were shilling for Donald Trump or for Boris Johnson not long ago, utterly unable to acknowledge the absolute depravity that both men introduced to public life. That's not loyalty. That's self-preservation. That's delusion. But sometimes it's very, very hard to turn on a former friend and say, you have let us all down. You think there's a virtue in defending someone who's in disgrace because you like them. You think that's loyalty. Charisma, I think, can be the same. Oh, he's very charismatic. Well, he might be charismatic. I presume that some serial killers were charismatic. Certainly some of the worst part. I mean, Farage is arguably charismatic, isn't he? He's a hideous human being by any moral or ethical measure. But the idea that Starmer is not charismatic, you could see as becoming something of a positive. In fact, something that Louise has picked up on already. I have this conversation with friends, she's just written, and they always say, but he lacks charisma. And I always respond that I actually like that. He's sincere and honest, the opposite of Johnson. It's a commitment to reality, which brings a sincere seriousness. Thank you for making this point. I'm really glad it can be turned around as a positive. Well, I'm not sure it can. I'm not sure it can. My emphasis was wrong in that sentence. I'm not sure it can, but I think it can, and I'm not going to mislead you. I kind of hope it can as well. So take a pause. I've got that little thought in the back of my head that I have sometimes, but I don't think it's fair. I say I want you to ring me if you don't normally ring radio phone-in programs, but that's not quite what I mean. What I mean is you have got a sufficiently open mind to have a dialogue, an internal dialogue about Keir Starmer. You can move. So I think I'm moving with that little caveat that I could be perhaps letting optimism lead me rather than evidence. But I think I'm moving from that concern at the lack of what I would call stardust rather than charisma. So Tony Blair had stardust, didn't he? Tony Blair had an ability to light up an audience. I don't think Keir Starmer has that. I used to think that was a problem. And there it is. I love it when that happens. I wrinkle it out live on the radio. And I used to think that was a problem, and now I don't. I actually don't. I don't think it's a problem. Do you? 0345 60 60973. And as I would hope I've just demonstrated, I think our opinions on issues like this are much more interesting if they've changed. You know, if you thought Keir Starmer was the Antichrist last year and you think he's the Antichrist today, I mean, you could probably get yourself a column in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, but I don't know how interesting it would be to listen to your reasoning. If you were worried about Starmer, if you thought he was brilliant last year, but you're really, really, really unimpressed with him today, that's interesting. I may question your sincerity because it seems to me to be quite an odd journey to have been on. But you'll be able to persuade me that you're in good faith, I'm sure. And then similarly, if you just thought, I don't know that he's the right man for the job. I don't know if he's quite got the kit and caboodle that he needs to deliver what I want. And now you're thinking, actually, maybe what I thought was a problem is actually a positive. Maybe what I thought was an issue is an asset. And I am getting there. I think I'm there already. The only reservation I have is that classic line, one of the most quoted lines in the history of this programme, which is, of course, it's not the despair that gets you. I can deal with the despair. It's the hope. So possibly I'm a bit dosed up on hopium this morning, and I'm trying to persuade myself. Well, I have successfully persuaded myself that Keir Starmer's steady, sober nature, his lack of stardust, his lack of sparkle, is actually at this time a measurable positive. But can I persuade you, or have you also been persuaded? Because the more you have been persuaded, the easier it becomes for me to conclude that I'm not high on hopium. I'm actually, as I always endeavour to do on this programme, I'm actually sort of measuring and responding to the evidence. It's coming up 10:15. Speaking of the history of this programme, congratulations to Nick, of course, to Nick Ferrari on his 20th anniversary. A few of you are asking whether it's mine. And the rather sad fact is we're not quite sure. I know you're supposed to make a big fuss about. We could have got Doris in Ongar to ring in and leave a lovely message on the answer phone. The thing is, I think I started on the same day that Nick did, but I think I was on trial. I think I did a fortnight, and then a very esteemed former boss of mine, one of the greatest radio minds this country has ever seen, then he was having a tryout as well, because he quite fancied having a go at this kind of radio. And I think that it was at the end of that period that I was given the nod. If memory serves, I was sitting in the back of a taxi in Mallorca when the call came through from LBC saying, we'd like to offer you the job full time. And I was desperately excited, but I don't think that was on January the 5th. So I think I was on air on January the 5th, but I don't think I actually had the job. So I guess that means I'm never going to be able to celebrate any anniversary at all, because nobody knows when I actually started work. Oh. Well, I do know the time. It's 10:15.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I think my favourite analogy for Keir Starmer, and it's not one I came up with myself, I forget where I first stumbled across it, was the one that posited the notion of him carrying a Ming vase across an ice rink. So he had something incredibly valuable in his possession, but getting to the destination with it, getting to the other side of the ice rink with it, was both hazardous and far from guaranteed. I wonder whether he is now beginning to pirouette a bit. He is now actually beginning to look as if he's never going to drop that vase, and therefore he might as well throw in a few triple spritzels, or whatever they're called. 18 after 10 is the time. And we're still searching for the right word. Considered. I should have written these down, shouldn't I? Considered, perhaps, is a good one. And this is nice from Crystal, who's in York. Please work out what the date of your anniversary would be, James, as I would love to hear Liz Truss and Boris Johnson congratulate you on your 20 years in the chat. Yes, me too, actually. I wonder if we could get hold of their phone numbers. Back to Keir Starmer. Matt's in Hitchin. Matt, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James. Nice to speak to you.
Hi,
and I listened to Nick and Keir early this morning.
Yes.
And I wanted to comment on the flip-flop that this country does between authentic and charismatic leaders. And we seem to have, well, it's not a disease as such, but I look back at and ignore the pre-Thatcher era of going from charismatic with Thatcher to, authentic with John Major, and then we go to Tony Blair, then we go to Gordon Brown.
Yeah, but that's not electoral, is it? Because both of those, I know Major won an election, but he replaced Thatcher as a consequence of an internal leadership battle, and Brown was more of a succession than an election, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I use the sort of similarity with business, where you can go from a charismatic CEO until things maybe go a bit wonky, and in steps the CFO to
that's
kind of steady the ship.
That's an interesting one. Even though Brown didn't. I mean, he did steady the ship, but he then lost the election. So
yes, he did. But whether that's an internal discussion to say, right, okay, we need someone with a more authentic face to fit.
Yeah, that's interesting. And does Starmer say, is that Starmer from where you're sitting?
I think it is
right.
At the moment, and I think the problem that Rishi Sunak had is he presented himself as an authentic leader, so we're going to leave the chaos behind. But unless he has the true backing of equally authentic people and starts to slip up with, let's say, mistruths, then that's shattered. Charismatic leaders can get away with it to a certain extent, but if you're going to be truly authentic, you've got to say what I mean, you've got to deliver. And I think that's pressure on Keir.
That's really well put, Matt. I've never thought of it like that. I've always sort of railed against the double standards of it all. And you know, Keir Starmer having a curry gets 13 pages of the Daily Mail front page, while Boris Johnson breaking laws and marriage vows like it was going out of fashion gets a completely free pass. But you're looking at that phenomenon from the other end of the telescope. It's that is charismatic sounds still complimentary, but that is what people get away with by dint of that personality. Whereas if somebody doesn't present themselves as fundamentally unserious, then they get held to higher standards. They're almost self-imposed high standards.
Exactly, and I speak as a finance director, and
right.
God forbid I would come up with anything that would be undone in front of my eyes,
yes,
because it would completely unravel my reputation, regardless of any internal struggle to say, well, if I say the absolute truth, I'm going to get pilloried for it. You have to do it.
So the CEO might be able to stand up in front of a conference and start, showering them with rhetorical brilliance and getting them all to cheer and stuff. But you can't do that. You've got to stick to the numbers. And if you start playing fast and loose with the facts, then you're out of the door double quick.
Yeah, and it's more damaging for somebody being authentic than it is for charismatic.
Gosh. And that explains so much, actually, of the last 10 years of last 15 years of politics on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, and it's only when I look back and I look at the flip-flop, I thought, God, it is one after the other.
Yes.
And I think we've got this right. We kind of take, I've forgotten her name. Who was in for about 40 days?
Liz Truss.
Yeah, easily. Kind of take her out of the equation.
Yeah, and where does Sunak fit into the equation, though?
Well, this is where he was going. He was supposed to be.
He was, wasn't he?
The authentic leader.
Yes.
But what we've seen over these last 6-9 months is those around him kind of ripping the carpet from under him. So he couldn't even present himself as authentic and doesn't have the power within the party to pull people in line. Whereas maybe some previous more strong authentic leaders.
Yeah, a reluctant culture warrior then, Rishi Sunak, whereas Starmer gets to, with the caveat that it means he's got to abide by higher standards than previous politicians, previous prime ministers in waiting or previous party leaders. That is really brilliant, Matt. And that, I love the way you've brought the business parallel into it. Has your own personal opinion of Keir Starmer changed over the last couple of years?
I think it has.
Yeah,
and I think listening to him more and more, he is building his case very strongly. His with all things with leadership, it's execution. What the British people want is execution now. They don't want the Johnson era back again at all.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, there's still plenty of people who would argue that they do want that, and a lot of them are in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, of course. But I agree with you. I agree with Matt. That the idea of going back to people who just lie and tell you things you want to hear and then turn you against anybody from refugees to single mothers or the police or doctors. I mean, it's just so exhausting and unnecessary. And you only have to stick your head out the window to see what the consequences are for a country. But there'll always be that weird rump of voters who will lap it up. And Keir Starmer will never reach them. This is where something that I did come up with, the Ming Vase thing, might have been Tony Blair, a couple of you have told me. But the footballification, the idea that you've got your scarf tied so tightly around your neck that you've cut off the flow of blood to your brain, your blue scarf, your Tory, or even perhaps more pertinently, your anti-Labour scarf, the kind of people who use words like socialist on Twitter without knowing what they mean. There are a lot of them out there. They're never going to be reachable. They're always going to be voting against their own interests because of a legacy of deference or class or ignorance or poor education or whatever it may be. Or selfishness, a weird warped selfishness. I'm going to vote for inequality even though I'm on the wrong side of it because one day I'll be on the right side of it. He's never going to reach them. But I think that new party that Farage's mate runs, they're probably going to be picking off the unpleasant, not very clever people. So who does that leave Rishi Sunak fighting for? Goodness only knows. Thank you, Matt. Stephen's in Southampton. Stephen, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Nice to speak to you. First-time caller.
Welcome aboard.
I was piqued by your comment about hearing from people who hadn't called before. And
Yes.
I guess I've never called a phone-in show before. So,
Here you are. There's no going back now, you know. You can never... that's it. It's gone forever. It's like virginity. Carry on, Stephen.
I mean, a couple of things. The word to describe Starmer, yes, sensible. I think grown-up is another way that I possibly think of him. He does have standards. I think Matt and you were talking a few minutes ago about standards, and I think that's interesting, but it points to one of my concerns still, is that it's a relative value compared to this current government and this lot of Tories who have been depraved. It could be a relative value. So by its nature, it makes Starmer look better than he is. But in terms of my own personal view, I did have trust issues with Starmer, particularly when he took over as the party. He was going to be a unifying leader. By the way, I am a Labour supporter.
Sure. And
I was a Labour activist, and I actually stood locally a few years ago. But I did hope and believe that Starmer would be a unifying leader, and I don't think he proved to be. So I did have trust issues with Starmer, and I did, I suppose, have some trust issues with the local party. But that has gone away over time. So not only do I think the party has a leader that has standards and is grown up and is increasingly credible, I've seen the same locally as well. Our local constituency chair is also eminently sensible, and I trust her. So for those reasons, I think I've changed and adjusted my view on Starmer. So previously I might have held my nose because I am on the left of the party.
Sure.
But actually I think, and particularly compared to the current crop of Tories, this current strange toxic breed that we've ended up with,
it is remarkable. I was thinking about that this morning before I came on air, about the sheer gulf, really, in character between the Labour front bench and the Conservative front bench. And I'd qualify that by saying there could have been people on that front bench like David Gauke or Dominic Grieve or even Rory Stewart, or, there could have been honourable people whose politics you and I would disagree with vehemently, but that we would at least acknowledge they were honourable, decent people. And instead you've got Suella Braverman until 10 minutes ago. You've got 30p Lee as deputy party. I mean, it is breathtaking, really.
Absolutely. My mum was an old school socialist, and she did look to what she used to call, the old one nation Tories, the Lord Carringtons of the party in the old days. And now I find myself looking fondly back, oddly, to the 70s with people like Lord Carrington, who are statesmen. They're kind of giants compared to the current crop of
they're just nasty, not very bright bullies, usually, is how you'd have to categorise them. And that can't be good for a country. But I always think of the mojito question at this point, because we've talked a lot about double standards, and without those double standards, driven in large part by right-wing media, you wouldn't have the gulf. Labour politicians as dismal as, say, Lee Anderson or Jonathan Gullis, or Suella Braverman or Priti Patel or James Cleverly. God, we'd be here all day. Labour politicians as objectively and obviously awful as all of those people would never rise, because they'd be cut off at the knees by media coverage, which is where I always think of the mojito. So this was what Matt's point was very strong about, the standards being higher, not necessarily set by biased media, but set by the promise to be better. So, if they get caught drinking a proverbial mojito on a train, then they're going to come under attack in a way that a Conservative politician saying truly disgusting things simply won't.
I totally agree, but that's the nature of the most of the mainstream right-wing press and media we have in this country. So we have to kind of park that a little bit. It is the reality, but that's not going to go away. It's certainly not going to go away soon. But I think going back to Starmer, he won't crash the bus. And I think someone like Suella Braverman, I think, would rather wrest the wheel from whoever's in control, and the whole thing may crash or go over the cliff.
That's it, isn't it? And you get that sense that he's in it for what he can do for the country, not what the country can do for him.
Yes, I think so. And I think whilst I still have reservations, as I think it's human nature, we should all have reservations and ask questions of our politicians and leaders. But I don't really hold with this kind of red Tory label or even blue label or stuff like that. I just think looking at the current crop, Starmer won't crash the bus. I think the man does have standards. I was trying to think, James, what's the opposite of depraved? And then I realised what a strange thought to have that you would actually think.
Well, hang on, I'm late. I'm going to be late for the news. What did you come up with?
Well, I couldn't, because the opposite of depraved is normal and decent and
That's all it is. That's all we want.
That's
all we want, please. A normal person. As well, I don't know if normal people go into politics, but what is the opposite of depraved? Keir Starmer. 10:30 is the time. Holly Harris has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Really, really good texts today. I mean, brilliant calls as ever, but really good texts as well. I'll do my best to read out as many as I can. In fact, here's a good way of doing both. Mike in Bristol praising the last caller. Thank you to that last caller. I'm a Labour member and have been frustrated and disillusioned with Starmer at times, as I am more to the left of the party. Your last caller has just shone a bit of light on it for me. Someone else said something very clever. It was that lovely woman, the teacher who rang in, who'd been out canvassing. I'd never heard it described like this before. She said, you're not marrying them when you cast your vote, or when you are assessing a party leader, as opposed perhaps to your constituency MP. It's not about finding a husband or a wife. It's about getting on a bus that you think is going in the best direction. And that's where some of the, perhaps, how can we put it politely, some of the people who remain very, very committed to the last Labour leader seem to be a little bit confused. There are only two buses to get on. And you can pretend that they're the same, I suppose, if you want, but you might as well pretend that the moon is made of cheese for all of the impact that's going to have on the rest of the world. So that's quite good. I am more to the left of Keir Starmer. Said my last caller and Mike in Bristol, this texter. But obviously he's steering the bus in a better direction than anyone else is going to anytime soon. 10:34 is the time. Jennifer is in Chiswick. Jennifer, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome aboard.
So I'm 19 years old, and I wanted to mention that...
Hang on, before you continue, I just have to point out that you weren't born when I started doing this job. Regardless of precisely which day my 20th anniversary falls on, I can say with some confidence that you weren't born when I first got behind this microphone. I'll just leave that hanging and let you continue, Jennifer.
And my point was going to be that I think growing up, my generation felt ignored, especially by conservatives, because obviously they don't see us as electorally beneficial. And looking at what Keir Starmer's policies are, I see he has a lot of educational reform in schools. I feel like the system that I grew up in education just felt so outdated. And I just see it very promising that he's willing to make these changes. And especially another thing is his policy where he wants to help stop violence against women as well. I think that's a demographic which has been largely ignored by conservatives, and even with, for example, James Cleverly's comments as well, that proves almost the opposite. It proves that he's... Well,
we could probably go for misogynistic. We couldn't go for anything
exactly.
more. And also, there's a fella who tried to be mayor. I don't know if you're familiar with the curse of O'Brien, Jennifer, but whenever I say anything vaguely warm about a Tory, they turn out to be even worse than the people I've never been warned about. There's a chap called Sean Bailey, who had a crack at being mayor, who's been saying some quite breathtakingly disgusting things about Carol Vorderman, of all people, in the last couple of days, which, I mean, if you looked up misogynist in the dictionary, I think it's quite likely you'd find a picture of Sean Bailey, and he was someone that the Tories considered suitable to run as a candidate for London mayor. When Starmer was a lawyer, certainly when he was DPP, his commitment to the fight against domestic violence was absolutely huge. It was one of the things I discovered when I interviewed him a couple of years ago on stage. That's a proper passion for him. It's a proper cause célèbre, and it comes from a place, as I think you've identified, it comes from a place of morality rather than a place of political calculation.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing is we're sick of hearing a lot of blame. So, for example, on migrants, even on people on benefits. So rather than say...
I'm going to do something
people.
good. I'm going to try and improve lives for people to win votes rather than to make lives worse for other people to win the votes of those who will be rubbing their hands with glee at the prospect of it. Thank you, Jennifer. I hope that's not your last call to the programme, although I allow myself that moment of self-indulgence to reflect upon the fact that you weren't born when I started. 0345 60973 is the number you need if you want to join in. Liz says, I love this young woman. She's absolutely right. I think Jeremy Corbyn actually provided young people with a sense of being seen by a politician, but Starmer seems to have done it as well. I would summarise Starmer, says Ash, as heedful. That's a great word. He's very aware of his every word and is careful to take moments to think about his stance before commenting. I too am very left politically, and I think Starmer has committed himself to regaining the trust of the voters. I think he's mindful of getting trust in order to secure the vote for a longer period. He's not my political favourite, but he is a crucial stepping stone in the political pendulum. Mixing your metaphors horribly there towards the end, Ash, but making a powerful point nonetheless. Composed is a word that's come through. Matty, who's in Suffolk, says, this morning you've coincidentally read my mind. It's not a coincidence, Matty. That's how the technology works these days. You've probably got one of those new devices, have you? That means I get a full readout. All I do, I just twist the dial. I go to Matty in Red Lodge in Suffolk, please. Could you just tell me what he's thinking at the moment? Have you not heard of these algorithms? This is how Dominic Cummings got Brexit over the line. It was just Facebook. The technology we've got now, you're listening on one of these fancy new devices, I can just find you and it will tell me what you're thinking. This morning you have coincidentally read my mind, says Matty. Charisma has no bearing on the case of being PM. It can shield the truth. It can mislead you away from what they really stand for. As usual, James, you're one step ahead of Bodger and the others. I don't know about that, but I have forgotten to refer to Johnson as the disgraced former Prime Minister, of course, which is my New Year's resolution. Anyone referring to Boris Johnson on this programme in the unfortunate event of us having to talk about him must refer to him as the disgraced former Prime Minister. So it's lovely to hear the disgraced former Prime Minister paying tribute to Nick earlier on the occasion of Nick's 20th anniversary on LBC. Philip's in Sandhurst. Philip, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
thanks for having me on.
I
hope it's not. I hope I'm still allowed to wish you and your family a prosperous New Year.
What's the
and
date?
A healthy one.
What's the date? It's the 5th.
It's
yes,
still
until
the first
you can
week,
have it until
so
Epiphany. Until Epiphany,
exactly.
Philip. So today's the final day, and the same to you and yours. The same to you. And yours.
Thank you very much. As my thoughts, I missed listening to Keir this morning, unfortunately, but I'll listen to it later. But what I believe is that what Keir has, which is completely absent from our current government,
yes,
is purely integrity. That's what grips it for me. That's the crux of my change of political view, because I voted Tory all my life. I'm the same age as you, perhaps
right.
a month or two apart, but he just has integrity, which is absolutely vacant from this government.
It is hard to think of somebody I could offer up now as a counter to what you've just said. I say, well, they're not all bad. I suppose Jeremy Hunt is the nearest. Jeremy Hunt is the nearest thing we've got to a senior Tory who doesn't seem to be cut from a particularly ugly cloth.
Yeah, I'd agree. And you named a few names just a little while ago with Rory Stewart, and I know your political views don't mirror theirs, but these are people who you think, yeah, okay, he's a stand up and down guy. He has a sense of decency and service.
Yes, and that is really coming through now, isn't it? I've had a fascinating message from somebody who has worked in this field, someone who's worked with campaigns and elections way back in the day, and the idea that in the last 10 months, the messaging, as they call it, has really kicked in, really playing to Keir's strengths. This idea that he's dull but worthy. that he should use government, the levers of government, to make the world better. And if you're a lifelong Tory voter, I think you're an early proof of the pudding that that's working, because that is what you are seeing now.
I think so, yeah, because if you think back to the sort of the national sense of grief at the loss of the Queen,
yeah,
it's because we lost someone who had an absolutely enormous sense of service and duty, and we had a government which was completely void of it. And we were sort of lost. Well, what are we left with? I know it's not comparable because one isn't.
No, but it is. It's a valid point. It's someone who seemed to embody values that the last crop or the post-Brexit crop of Conservative politicians have absolutely not embodied. They haven't just not embodied them. They've almost sort of become emblems of the opposite of values and integrity. Let's not get too rose-tinted about this. There's still time for you to ring in and give Keir Starmer a right old kicking. I'd rather hear a kicking from the right than the left, because the kickings that Keir Starmer receives from the left are just so predictable. But don't. I mean, you're still welcome. I'm just saying, I'm trying to make people who would come at him from the right more welcome. Yes, someone's just pointed out I just said something vaguely nice about Jeremy Hunt, so the curse of O'Brien will be kicking in 5, 4, 3, 2. Well, I can tell you, when he did my holiday cover, the team liked him, and I won't embarrass anybody by telling you who they didn't like, but it is not commonplace. I chose my word very carefully there. It is not commonplace for the team, and admittedly, as I explained to them endlessly, the bar is set very high for that. I mean, for someone to come in and to be liked by the team when they work every day with one of the most likeable, charming, decent, kindly people probably in the history of humanity, never mind in the history of broadcasting, when that's their daily diet of loveliness, it's not easy for someone to come in and do holiday cover and make a warm impression on them. But Jeremy Hunt did. Jeremy Hunt categorically did. And I always think it's worth mentioning that, now, mainly because I value my team so highly. And if someone has made a good impression on them and taken the time and made the effort to make a good impression on them, then I respect them. I respect their respect, as it were. 10:45 is the time. More on this to follow. And I think we might be catching up, speaking of that front bench, with the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:48 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I need to be careful. I get what my mum used to call, you've got the devil in you, or something like that. Is that a phrase? And it's a mood. You get it sometimes. It's not like you spend your entire life with this overdeveloped sense of mischief, but I get it sometimes when I'm on air. It's something weird about being in this room talking to you. And sometimes I get the devil in me. So lots of you are speculating on the politicians who've done my holiday cover and what the team actually thought of them. And you're wondering which ones perhaps didn't make a very good impression. And I'm not going to play this game because it would be very indiscreet and I'd probably get into trouble. But Marvin Brentwood, you're absolutely right. They all hated him. But I'm not going to tell you who Marvin Brentwood was speculating about. 10:49 is the time. You also got a rather lovely turn of phrase there, Marv. 10:49 is the time. Talking about Keir Starmer, a little short of people who are sincerely critical of him. And I think that's probably the point, isn't it? You can ring in and say Labour are going to give all the money away, or I don't know if anyone is still recycling that dreadful attempt to pretend that Liam Burns' note that he left behind in the Treasury, the one about there not being any money left, is politically significant or even true. Yeah, but they probably will when the election comes closer. All the usual suspects, the sort of second division Tory politicians and the client journalists, they'll be going back to Liam Burns' note and pretending that it's substantive or significant or meaningful. But in terms of constructive and intelligent criticism of Keir Starmer, it used to be pretty much confined to the perceived lack of charisma. If that becomes a positive, then he develops almost a Teflon coating, doesn't he? If the lack of charisma, if the dull but worthy sense of duty, if that becomes something that voters are associating with him, then the dullness bit actually loses any salience as an attack line, which will leave the Tories having to... the Telegraph's already tried to attack him for doing some lawyering when he was a lawyer. I don't know if you remember that. That was in the week just before Christmas. If you are a barrister, something called the cab rank rule applies, which means that a case you are capable of fighting, if it comes along, if it comes up at the cab, then you have to get in it. So he got in some cabs that the Telegraph then tried to attack him for, because it turned out that the cab was defending criminals or accused people who were not very savoury or not very salubrious. But that, of course, would be, had Keir Starmer spent his pre-political career as a surgeon, the Daily Telegraph would be attacking him for having treated prisoners or having treated nasty people. You don't have a choice as a surgeon on who gets wheeled in and wheeled out of your operating theatre. But hey-ho, far be it from me to lecture the Daily Telegraph on what journalism is or is not. I'd simply remind you that today they carry a story that appears genuinely under the headline, "Cut Benefits for the Out of Work to Cut CEO Taxes." And it contains the line, "Britain's CEOs have earned more than the median salary this year." That was published yesterday on January the 4th. That's when the CEOs of the FTSE 100 companies had already earned as much money as the average worker in the United Kingdom will earn in 2024, will earn all year. A writer in the Daily Telegraph concludes, "It's a disgrace that it took so long," i.e. they should be earning that in less than 2.5 days. "It is grievously unfair," writes someone called Matthew Lynn, and you wonder what think tank, or rather what lobby group masquerading as a think tank he might be associated with. I don't know off the top of my head whether he is or not. "It is grievously unfair," he writes, "that British executives are paid so little." And that's where the right-wing media has gone now. Right, do you know what the problem with this country is? The people being paid more than anybody in it are not being paid enough. Yeah, we'll print that, we'll publish that. And then Keir Starmer, of course, increasingly successfully cast as the polar opposite of that sort of perspective. Although, as Sarah points out, perhaps the Telegraph will try and portray Rishi Sunak as even more boring than Keir Starmer. That would be quite interesting. Jed's in York. Jed, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I'm the first-time caller as well.
Welcome.
Thank you. My word for Keir Starmer is decency, and I think we've had morality, we've had integrity, but I quite like decency. And do you know what I related it to? You know, the post office people who were treated so appallingly, that's been dramatised recently. And I just think when you saw those people together, my thought was, these are all decent people. And these are like the heart of England, the backbone of British people. This is what the good people of England are like. And
that's a really interesting one. I haven't watched the drama. I'm across the story.
Oh, you must.
No, I know. It's on my list. I could watch Toby Jones read The Phone Directory, Jed.
Oh, I agree. I agree completely.
What an actor. Absolutely breathtaking, isn't he?
And Julie Hesmondhalgh as well.
Oh, we love Julie Hesmondhalgh. But she, not she, but the story is one of, epic malfeasance from what we'd have to loosely describe as the establishment that would have gone unchecked and did and continues to have ruined almost countless lives, but was checked finally by the resolve of one sort of unlikely hero, as it were.
Yeah, but also, there was a Tory politician in there who took up the cause and was
Nadeem
very helpful.
Nadeem Zahawi did a decent job on it.
No, he was on it.
Oh.
He got a little bit part on the show.
Yes, he played himself, I'm told. He played himself,
yes.
I'm told.
Yeah, this was the Lord, I think.
Okay, that's a call that I think you should always say no to. Would you like to play yourself in a?
He looked as if he was enjoying it, I have to say.
He always looks as if he's enjoying it, doesn't he? That's part of the problem with this lot. Have you always been on board with Starmer, or has he wooed you slightly? Have you moved closer to him?
He's wooed me slightly.
Yes.
He's wooed me slightly. I have sort of... My opinion has been, he'd make a great deputy, like Gordon. That's what I've always thought about Gordon Brown. He was a great deputy and he wasn't really a leader. But, compared to what other alternatives we have in the Tory party, he's a decent human being who's got ideas.
Yes, and that does seem to be the mission as it were, and it does seem to be working. He is over the detail. He's clever. He's a good man at heart. You may not agree with his policies. You may never agree with his policies. But he is now, the dullness is becoming a strength, and people are seeing that what he does with a good heart. And that sort of brings me back to that holy trinity of Tories that we often refer to on the programme, the sort of Gawke, Grieve, Stewart triumvirate of people who you would disagree with, but you know that they are in politics for good reasons. I did a fascinating interview with Dominic Grieve just before Christmas on full disclosure, and you know that you may never agree with their policies, but you can buy in completely to the idea that they are motivated by good motives, decent motives. Wrong but decent would be, you know, and if Starmer can nail that, then he's over the line. It becomes very, very easy to sort of move that into prime ministerial territory, as opposed to, as Jed alluded to, as opposed to deputy. Peter is in Oxford. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. First of all, I agree entirely that we need a Starmer-led government next, whether it's a sole Labour or coalition is open for debate. But I think I disagree about the importance of charisma. You know, he's quite clearly doesn't have the kind of charisma that some other politicians have, but that doesn't matter. But he's got his leadership skills, and I think he'd be a fantastic prime minister.
But you've always been on side with him, though? I think, Peter, you haven't sort of moved, because I find myself quite buoyed at the beginning of 2024 by the thought that things I previously saw as potential weaknesses are perhaps turning, well, for me, they are genuinely turning into strengths.
Well, let me tell you the main weakness, I think, and that's the ability to listen. And I think there are four issues on which he departs from his party. Obviously, Gaza at the moment. Then PR, where the party is very strongly in favour. Relations with Europe, where I think he could be much more positive than he is at the moment. I think he's sacrificing a lot of votes, and I think even the pundits are saying that now. And then finally, very significantly, imposing candidates on local parties. And I mean, Hartlepool should have been a shot across the bows for him, because that was a disaster. It didn't have to happen. And ever since then, you know, there has been a policy of putting candidates in place. And the problem with all those four things is that they're going to alienate the local activists. And I think his advisors have been focusing on what voters want, but you've got to think about what activists want.
That's an interesting point.
If you make activists think, well, for heaven's sake, he's just Tory light, we'll stay home, we won't knock on doors, then the voters won't come out. They'll stay home, and that will be disastrous. So you really got to fire up the activists. And I hope he's listening. I was trying to get on the show earlier when he was on. I think he was very good on Nick's show. But I would love to have said this to him face to face, because I just don't think it's occurred to him.
It's a bit of a fork, isn't it? That, because activists, it's really, really interesting that you've put it brilliantly, because you can see why you would prioritise voters over activists. But of course, a disillusioned activist base, as you say, is not going to get the vote out on the scale that it would do if it was engaged. But what if, Peter, and I think this is probably true, what if the means by which he engages the voter are the means by which he alienates the activist? What if it's the same thing?
Well,
what if they're irreconcilable?
Well, it may be a dichotomy. I mean, absolutely. He may have a dilemma about that. But, you know, I think just focusing on red wall seats and thinking about what voters they want to the exclusion of all else is self-destructive. And I think you've got to look at the broader picture. No party is going to be successful unless there are actually people who, you know, wear out the shoe leather on the roads. I mean, you know, I've been there, done that.
I hear you, but I'm going to nick that word dichotomy, because I mean, you've highlighted a problem, an issue. I think you're probably closer to it than many people listening by dint of your own activism that I think you alluded to. But what if the way to woo the voter is the same way in which you certainly alienate activists who were enthused by the party leadership the last time round, wouldn't you, in 2019, although the policy platform in 2019 was far from unattractive. It was just the salesman, not the product, that was the problem then. But yeah, you're right. If you feel that they're bending too far towards alienated red wall voters, or whatever you want to call them, then you have to start worrying about who you leave behind. I'm more optimistic than you on that one. I think, you know, plenty of people voted Labour in 2019 despite the leadership, and people you described could do that in 2024.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 11 is the time, and we will turn our attention next to something just alluded to in the news. Well, not alluded to in the news. Tom talking about Keir Starmer, essentially, remember, as a former director of public prosecutions, putting some weight behind the idea that Andrew Windsor, the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew, he should face a police investigation. The latest allegations to emerge in America are lurid. Even the newspapers that have been queuing up to pretend that Prince Harry is public enemy number one have found themselves going in pretty hard on Harry's uncle today. The Sun, time to give Andrew the chop. I mean, what that would involve? Would they take away his title? Detailed claims emerging. And remember, they're all claims, they're all allegations, and Andrew Windsor has vehemently denied all of them, even as he gave millions and millions of pounds of his late mother's money to one of the young women who made these allegations, that he attended. The latest claim is that he took part in an underage orgy, is the phrase that the Sun deploys, and that he groped a young woman's breast while she sat on his lap like Santa. Claims that an underage girl was told to give Windsor whatever he demanded while on Epstein's private Caribbean resort on Little St James, which has of course been dubbed Paedophile Island. Now, his mum, his late mother, in an act that must have been an enormous torture for her, stripped him of his royal roles, banished him from public duties. So he's still Prince, effectively, officially. He's still the Duke of York, of course. But he has lately crept back into royal life. I don't know how closely you watch these things, but he was at Sandringham with the family at Christmas. He had a position of some prominence at the funeral of his late mother. The idea that he was persona non grata has been somewhat undone, I would argue, over the course of the last year. And the feeling of the newspaper media this morning is very much that pendulum has now swung sharply back in the opposite direction. Even the Times goes with Epstein files prompt call to prosecute Prince, and the Mail, no way back. New Epstein bombshell for Prince. Andrew will never return to royal fold after underage orgy claims. Now, the relationship between palace and press is a very interesting one that I don't know a great deal about, but the fact that these stories are all tilting at the same windmill, they all seem to be singing from a similar hymn sheet, is unlikely to be a coincidence. So words like crystallise, the new court papers will crystallise the King's determination to act. Insiders tell the Mail plans will go ahead to force the Prince out of Royal Lodge. And then the question becomes, well, what does a punishment look like for Andrew Windsor? And part of the punishment would involve being turfed out of the house he lives in and moving into a house called Frogmore Cottage, which was, of course, home to Prince Harry and his wife Meghan until quite recently. And that, to me, crystallises, to use the word of the day, that crystallises something truly rotten at the heart of royal coverage in this country. That a man who faces lurid allegations of sex offences against young women and girls, his punishment would involve being given the home that his utterly undisgraced nephew had to sort of vacate when he decided to get out of the country rather than be driven mad by the untapped tidal wave of abuse and vitriol directed at his wife in particular, and at him as well. And I'm drawn today to a coma conversation. Do you know what a coma conversation is on this program? Where when someone's been asleep for 10 years and you have to try to explain to them what is happening in the news. It's not a device you can reach for too often. I'm tempted every day. Every day there's, can you just explain to me how on earth, 30p Lee could be deputy chairman of Michael Heseltine's party? It's absolutely breathtaking. But you haven't been asleep for 10 years. But you're going to have to take my word for it. Harry's media coverage in this country has been measurably and considerably worse than his uncle's. Just pause for a minute. Even if you're already foaming at the bile duct at the mention of Meghan, just pause for a moment and reflect upon the fact that the abuse heaped upon the Duchess of Sussex and Prince Harry has dwarfed the criticism of and the coverage of Andrew Windsor. I mean, arguably, if it wasn't for that seminal interview conducted by Emily Maitlis when she was at Newsnight, before her arrival here, of course, as one of the presenters of the News Agents, if it wasn't for that interview with Maitlis, I mean, one wonders whether he'd still be clinging on to even more bogus credibility, even more trappings of inherited influence and power. It's quite incredible. But it was when they moved him in, it was when I read this morning that the punishment would involve being given Prince Harry's old house, that I really found myself thinking, how the hell has this happened? How has a man now named severally in court papers alleging all manner of abuses and unpleasantness ended up getting an easier ride from British media, and it's not just newspapers, it extends, of course, to some broadcasters. How has he got an easier ride than the military veteran, than the war hero? Prince Harry. Actually, that's possibly not a fair comparison, because Andrew did fly helicopters in the Falklands War as well, so he fits that description too. So I get a bit dewy-eyed at that footage of Harry giving the interview, and I think he was at Bastion, was he at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan? And a siren went off, and he just so matter-of-factly took off the microphone and just legged it, running towards... I know you're a lot safer in a helicopter than you are on the ground, and all of that usual malarkey that I get sent at times like this. But it, I don't know why, it just moved me. It just seemed so at odds with the perception of the royal family that I'd grown up with. And I'm not a critic of the current king. I think he was way ahead of the game on a whole host of subjects, and I think in his own way he's been quite courageous in some ways. But I don't know, I'm just a big fan of Prince Harry. I make no bones about it. And because I'm quite a big fan of Prince Harry, albeit with a fat slice of cynicism about the whole royal institution itself, you know, because I can see the madness that the British media has undertaken in the last few years. I mean, genuine madness. So here you have it, a man who stands accused of all manner of abuses, sexual abuses, who has paid millions of pounds to one of his accusers while insisting upon his innocence, has received an easier ride from the British media, from almost all of the British media, from all of the popular British media, than Prince Harry, whose offence still remains unspecified. It's quite extraordinary. And I'd like you to tell me why and how that's happened. Why do you think Andrew Windsor has received an easier ride from the British media than Prince Harry? And this may be a subject in which you're much better informed than I am. I interviewed Omid Scobie just before Christmas. Another full disclosure. That's good, isn't it? There's 2 plugs for full disclosure. We had a good run before Christmas. So Dominic Grieve, well worth listening to if you are even vaguely interested in politics. And Omid Scobie, absolutely compulsory listening if you're even vaguely interested in the royal family. And I got a little glimpse of what that world is like by talking to Omid, who I rather liked and enjoyed talking to. And who, of course, the following week turned out to be a key witness in the pursuit of Mirror Group newspapers for phone hacking. But I got a little glimpse of what that world is like, and that the depth of some of the theories surrounding key royals. And that's what I mean when I say it might be an area that you think you're better informed on than I am. But remember, I know a bit about newspapers. I know a bit about the media. And I can't give you a copper-bottomed answer to the question of why the man accused of serial sexual abuses has received an easier ride from my former colleagues on Fleet Street and some of my current colleagues in the broadcast media than Prince Harry and his wife. Why do you... How do you explain that to someone who's been asleep for 10 years? So let's say they fell asleep when Harry was the most popular royal in the country. Okay? And they woke up when Andrew's on all the front pages, mired in sexual abuse allegations, and Harry's living in a sort of self-imposed exile in California because the atmosphere in this country became intolerable for him and his young family. Why? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I will play the role, that's a role I'll quite enjoy, I will play the role of the person who's been asleep for 10 years. I'd quite like to sleep for 10 years. Sometimes. Do you ever wake up feeling that you could sleep forever? There's a story in the news today, we may get onto it in the next hour actually, about long COVID and the impact that it has upon you in terms of fatigue and muscle pain. And I think it is... Listen, I always have to be careful when I say things like this. Because, of course, I'm speaking, if you've suffered from long COVID, if you are suffering from long COVID, I'm speaking directly to you. And if I say it's a tricky phone-in topic because it can be quite dull and repetitive, I think that's probably a criticism of me rather than you. I need to find ways to talk about these things that close the door on dullness and repetition. Or I suppose we could do a Keir Starmer and try and turn the dullness into a positive. But I am really interested in that topic and in that subject. I just haven't yet found a way to make it exciting or interesting, engaging, compelling. Compelling's a good word. And I may have another crack at that at 12. I mention it because how do you know? What's the difference between just being tired all the time because you're stressed and working hard, or busy and knowing that there's something medical going on, knowing that there's something deeper going on beneath the bonnet? I do not know. It's coming out to 11:15. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to tell me, who has been asleep for 10 years, why Andrew Windsor has received an easier ride over the last few years, despite being mired in lurid allegations of sexual abuse, than his nephew Prince Harry, who has done absolutely nothing wrong. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Hit the numbers now, and you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
17 minutes after 11 is the time. I've been asleep for 10 years. When I fell asleep, Prince Harry was beloved. He was the nation's darling. He's probably the most popular royal in the country. No one really spared a thought for Andrew Windsor. I woke up this morning. Andrew Windsor's all over the front pages because he is mired in yet more lurid sexual abuse allegations. And I can't find Prince. It turns out he's living in California in a form of self-imposed exile. So I had a little look at the cuttings file. I had a little look back at how the royal family has been covered in recent years. And it turns out him and his wife in particular have been turned into public enemies number 1 and 2. So I'd like to know how that happened, please. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Jason is in Marylebone. Jason, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I just feel that your original question was, why do we think this is happening with the difference between Prince Andrew and Prince Harry?
We call him Andrew Windsor on this programme.
Sorry, Andrew okay. Windsor. So I was calling him Andy. And I think from my point of view, I think it's because Prince Harry, for every time he writes a book, every time he does an interview...
I think he's only written one book.
But he's often in the media recently, and a lot of the time that he's in the media is because of what he's doing whilst he's in California. So if you bring yourself to that forefront, you're then going to set yourself up for the abuse that he's been getting recently if people don't agree with him.
Well, hang on a minute, mate. His brother and his wife are in the papers all the time. They get reported for cutting ribbons.
But they're doing that as their duty. That's their duty, is what they are. Right. So they're not going to Netflix, and they're not getting TV programs made about them. They haven't written a book about their life. They haven't.
That's all happened since he left the country, and the question is looking at the coverage that he received before he left the country, the coverage that led them to decide they couldn't live in the country, and just to pick up on that. I mean, having pointed out the flaw in your theory, I'm still interested in how you arrived at it. Why would you have you personally have a problem with anybody, but them in particular, writing a book or signing a deal with Netflix?
I have absolutely no problem with it whatsoever.
Well, then what are you doing on the radio then, Jason?
I'm trying to answer your question.
But you can't theorise about what other people are thinking. I need to speak to people who've actually got a problem with him writing a book or signing that. I mean, okay, well, you explain to me why anyone would have a problem I wrote a book this year. I try not to mention it on the radio too much, but it's done all right. It was in fact in the Waterstones Piccadilly window. It was right next to Prince Harry's book, which I found quite touching. So why shouldn't he write it? Why do you think some people think he shouldn't be writing books?
But that's just pure ignorance that people should think he shouldn't write a book. Of course he can write a book. You've written a book. I've written a book. But when I wrote my own book, I then knew that I was putting myself up in the shop window to potentially be criticised because I went out publicly with a book. And that's exactly what Prince Harry did. Andrew Windsor stands accused
of sexually abusing young girls. I mean, in a way, you're kind of proving my point for me. So the question is, how come the bloke mired in lurid allegations of sex abuse gets an easy ride from the British media? And to use your explanation, the bloke who wrote a book gets a kicking. Do you see how mad that is?
Yeah, because Andrew's kept a low profile. He's kept out of the way. He's kept out of the media. And he's basically stayed out of the way. If he'd have written a book...
He gave millions of pounds to a young woman who accused him of raping her. How is that keeping a low profile?
Because they did that to hush the whole situation.
No, you see, what you've accidentally done, and I say this with love, you've proved my point. You've not challenged it or explained it. So really what you've demonstrated is that the bloke mired in lurid sex allegations has, from your perspective, had a lower media profile than the bloke who's made a couple of documentaries and written a book. Now, who made that decision, Jason? Andrew and Harry or the media?
Well, obviously it's the media, but
so how can you blame Harry for the fact that they write about him more than they write about his disgraced uncle?
Because if Harry had have gone to California and just...
So you're trying to have your cake and eat it. You are talking about your own opinions.
Hang on a minute, but you're not giving me a chance to actually say what I'm trying.
Yeah, of course I am. I'm just pointing out for people listening that we know you do believe this stuff, even though you're pretending that you don't. You have got a problem with Harry.
Why have I got a problem with Harry?
Good, because of the way you're talking.
I'm upset that Harry left the country. I'm upset that it didn't pan out because I think when Harry met Meghan, I think it was a great love story, and I thought the media handled it superbly well, other than Danny Baker's ridiculous picture that he wrote when they had their baby. But I thought it all started off incredibly well.
You're joking, aren't you? She got accused of having flowers in her bouquet on her wedding day that might kill Princess Charlotte, and then it turned out that Kate Middleton had the same flowers in her bouquet.
But the story didn't start on their wedding day. It started when they first met each other.
Oh, you haven't read the book, have you?
No,
but you've just got strong opinions about why he shouldn't have written it. And listen, I say this, as I say, the fact that you think Andrew has kept a low profile while Harry has drawn lots of attention to himself is based upon, it's literally predicated upon the amount of newsprint that editors have decided to dedicate to them. So the question of why are editors attacking that bloke over there who's done nothing wrong while going relatively easy on that bloke over there who is accused of all sorts of things. I mean, kind of... Also, he did the Mateless interview, Jason. How can you say he's kept a low profile? Bless you. 23 after 11 is the time. A bit of a gear change now, but that is the nature of radio phone-in programmes, and I don't think I will be asking the Shadow Chancellor and Labour MP for Leeds West about her views upon the Prince Harry-Andrew Windsor dichotomy. We have rather more important matters to discuss. Well, I say that we've got rather more important matters to discuss, Rachel Reeves, but you are spending much of today, I believe, unveiling a poster.
We've unveiled the poster today which exposes Rishi Sunak's raw deal, that he's promising tax cuts, but actually the tax burden is going up on ordinary working families. In fact, the average family in Britain is going to be paying £1,200 more in tax because of all of the 25 Tory tax increases we've had these last few years.
So, I mean, what he's claiming it's going to go down year on year, is he? And you're pointing out that it's going up decade on decade or 5 year on 5 year.
It's going up every single year and will continue to do so. So on the one hand, Rishi Sunak says, we've cut national insurance. What he doesn't say is we've frozen the thresholds, and so people are paying more in tax than they were last year, the year before, and the year before that. People are going to be paying more in taxes at the end of this Parliament than they were at the beginning, and for each of the next 5 years, under the Tory plans, the tax burden is expected to rise further, and it is always the ordinary working man and woman that pays the price for that.
How do you convey all that in a poster?
It says Rishi Sunak's raw deal.
That's it, is it? You've got to fill in the gaps yourself.
£1,200 worse off under the Tories.
We need high-ish taxes, don't we, to sustain the kind of public spending that the country's crying out for. It's odd territory for Labour to be fighting on this in some ways.
Apart from Labour is the party of working people, and we want working people to have more of their own money in their pockets. But we recognise that the NHS is desperately in need of an injection of cash, and that's why we would get rid of the non-dom tax status. You know, Rishi Sunak, he always increases taxes on the working person. He never asks those with the broadest shoulders to pay a little bit more. And we've got people who live in the UK, they've made their home here, they bring up their families here, they work here, and yet they claim this tax loophole whereby if their father was born abroad, they say, oh, actually, for the purposes of tax, I'm not domiciled in the UK, I'm going to pay my taxes somewhere else. That's not right. We would close that loophole.
Remind me how much you think you're going to raise by closing that loophole.
Well, we think if we replace it with a fair system for people who are genuinely here for short periods of time, that we could raise just over £2 billion every single year. And now we would put that money into our NHS, as well as having breakfast clubs at all primary schools to help working parents and to ensure that all kids get a good start to the day.
So, I mean, it's not going to go that far, is it, in the context of...
It's £2 billion a year. I mean, over the course of a parliament, that's £10 billion going into our health service and going into those breakfast clubs that isn't going in today. And with that money, we could create an additional 2 million appointments a year, which is absolutely vital when we've got a situation at the moment that 7.8 million are on waiting lists. So,
waiting list in an NHS that has an annual budget in excess of £150 billion a year.
Well,
that's in England
2 million
alone.
people who are not 2 million people who are not getting appointments today would, through Labour's plan to close the tax loophole for non-DOMs, would now be able to get an appointment. And government is about choices. And our choice would be to close that loophole and put the money into the NHS. This Tory government's choice is to keep that loophole for some of the very wealthiest people and to deprive the NHS of that money that it desperately needs.
And some of the owners of newspapers that routinely give them a very easy ride, Rachel Reeves. You're picking a fight with some very powerful people on that front.
Well, we're doing the right thing, and we think that the voters should have a choice in a general election. I see that the Prime Minister bottled it yesterday, but people in Wellingborough, where I am today, which will have a by-election next month because of another scandal, another Conservative MP, this time on sexual harassment grounds, has been forced to stand down. So there'll be a by-election here, but people want a general election. They want a choice of who governs Britain. This year, at some point, people will have that choice, but people want it now. Bring it on. What is Rishi Sunak so scared of?
Well, when it is brought on, when the election is called, the criticisms or the questions about the lack of detail in some of your plans, some of these criticisms are unfair, of course, but some of them are not. You're going to have to move quite quickly to put a lot of flesh on those bones, aren't you?
Well, I've just given you a really clear example of one choice.
I've heard it 100
Labour
times
make.
before about the non-dom stuff. And to be fair, Rachel Reeves, it reminds me a little of when my daughter asked me, when she was much younger, if she could spend her birthday money again.
Well, look, I've said how that money is going to be spent. Breakfast clubs are all primary schools and money for the NHS, and those are the choices that an incoming Labour government would make. And here's another choice. At the moment, there's a loophole whereby private schools don't pay VAT or business rates. We would close that loophole and put every single penny of that money into state schools, because you know that there are schools that the concrete is caving in, kids are being taught in porter cabins, we've got unqualified teachers in the classroom. We want that money to be put into our state schools. That is a choice that an incoming Labour government would make. But most of all, our plans are about growing the economy, more good jobs, paying decent wages in all parts of the country, with an industrial strategy that we've drawn up alongside business, pro-worker, pro-business, because we know that both are dependent upon the other. A plan to give this country, to give Britain its future back, with a serious plan for economic growth that can lift living standards and ensure that we have the money to sustainably invest in our public services. And all we want is a chance to put that to the people in a general election.
Well, that's the recurring theme. It's going to get a bit tired, isn't it? It's going to be the next 6 months. You're going to be trotting out the general election line. I understand.
Or he could just call one. And we could just get on with it.
This is true. Final question. It's not from me. It's from James, who's texted in. Not a very complimentary text, but I'll skip the rude bits. It just says, I am one of Rachel Reeves's middle-class milk cows with the broadest shoulders. We have been bled dry by New Labour and the New Labour tribute band that is Rishi Sunak and co. When she gets in, people like me are going to have even more taken offers, enough time to leave or retire. I mean, can you put a threshold on, when you say that the people with the most are going to have to pay more, can you put a threshold on who is going to end up paying more than they currently do and who isn't? Is it just non-dom at the moment, or is there an income threshold as well?
We will not be putting up income tax or national insurance. We're not going to be putting up taxes on working people.
So the only
people
who should fear a Labour government are non-dom taxpayers.
Well, we've put forward 3 tax increases. That private equity bonuses, that private equity bonuses should be taxed fairly. That the loophole whereby private schools don't pay VAT or business rates, so the 7% of people who send their children to private schools will pay a bit more, and we will get rid of that non-dom tax status.
So if James is in none of those categories, he's got nothing to worry about.
Then he won't pay. But even if you are in one of those categories, you can see the damage that the Conservatives have done to our schools and our hospitals.
Well, it's funny you should say that.
It's time for change in Britain.
Because I am and I can. But enough about me. Rachel Reeves, many thanks indeed. That's quite an interesting platform, isn't it? If you focus on non-dom taxpayers, people in receipt of epic sort of hedge fund banker style bonuses, and those of us lucky enough to be able to afford to send our children to private school. I mean, if you're not going to target them when you need to raise a few more quid for public services in desperate need of cash, then who the hell are you going to target? Well, I can tell you, if you're writing for the Daily Telegraph and your name is Matthew Lynn, you think you should take money off people who are in receipt of welfare payments in order to cut the taxes of the richest people in the country, of the FTSE 100 CEOs. It's 11:32. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:35. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Some sad and breaking news for you now, particularly sad news for those of us here at Global Radio, because Kate Garraway, of course, is family on our sister station Smooth, and she has revealed in the last few minutes that her husband Derek has passed away. You'll allow me, I'm sure, to read her statement in full. Kate is a friend of mine, and indeed so was Derek. So it's a particularly sad moment. Kate has written in the last few minutes, I'm sad to have to tell you that my darling husband Derek has passed away. As some of you may know, he has been critically ill following a cardiac arrest in early December, which, because of the damage inflicted by COVID in March 2020, led to further complications. Derek was surrounded by his family in his final days, and I was by his side, holding his hand throughout the last long hours and when he passed. I have so much more to say, and of course I will do so in due course. But for now, I just want to thank all the medical teams who fought so hard to save him, and to make his final moments as comfortable and dignified as possible. Sending so much love and thanks to all of you who have so generously given our family so much support. Rest gently and peacefully now, Derek, my love. I was so lucky to have you in my life. And our condolences and our love go to Kate and her children and their children. I'd take a moment, if I may, to pay a little tribute to Derek Draper. You remember I said to you earlier about when Mum would say to you that you've got the devil in you, or you had a sense of mischief. Derek Draper's sense of mischief was one of the most finely tuned and enjoyable to witness that I have ever had the pleasure of encountering. I mean, he was so naughty. It would beg a belief. He moved across all sorts of areas, working in sort of strategy and campaigning for the Labour Party. Popped up on the Daily Express with a column when I worked there. And he was something of a stalwart, shall we say, of the social scene as well. And you always knew, if you saw him across across a room on the rubber chicken circuit, or you were to bump into him at a book launch or a political event, you always knew that if you could just sort of inveigle yourself into his orbit, then you would have a laugh painted, a very big smile painted on your face within moments. That's why it was so striking. I mean, all illness is sad and all deaths are heartbreaking, but it sometimes seems that the more life you have, the more life a person possesses, the more vivacity, the more vitality a person possesses, the sadder it is to see it seep away. And Derek Draper, I can tell you for a fact, was so lively and so vital that he will leave a very big hole in many people's lives and will always be very, very fondly remembered. Our love, as I say once again, to my friend and colleague here at Global Radio, Kate Garraway, who has announced in the last few minutes that her husband, Derek Draper, has passed away. It's coming up to 22:12. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The reason, to return us to the question of why Andrew Windsor, a couple of you crossed with me. You think I was a bit hard on Jason, who rang in for Mary LeBone, and you may well be right. You know me, I always take criticism on the chin and seek to adjust my attitude accordingly. But the reason I was a bit impatient with him is because he was very much giving the impression that when you say, why has Harry ended up with such a kicking from the media, the idea that it's his own fault for refusing to dance to the media's tune, for writing his own books, for putting his own side of the story. And you say, well, he gives all these interviews. Andrew gave an interview to Emily Maitlis in which his entire life was sort of falling about his feet by the end of it. And he stood up and walked away thinking he'd played a blind. I mean, it just doesn't hold. It is, of all the subjects we cover together on the radio, the one that I think most illustrates the subtle ways in which the media infects the way we think is this one. Because so many people who would ordinarily know much better and have quite a clear line on things are absolutely persuaded that Harry and Meghan are the wrong uns. And that the royal family as it is, or Kate and William, or even Andrew Windsor, that they're the good guys. It's extraordinary, and it hasn't happened by accident. It is the best example, with the possible exception of Brexit, it is the best example of media gaslighting that I have witnessed in my life. And speaking of Brexit, find me someone that hates Harry and Meghan, but can't really tell you why, except something, loyalty, something, and I'll find you someone that voted for Brexit. In almost every case, but perhaps not every. 20-12 is the time. So you explain to me how the man mired in really mired for years now in lurid sex abuse allegations, vehemently denied, but whenever you are reminded of the vehement denial, you must also be reminded of the millions of pounds paid to one of his accusers in order to make one legal case go away. Gets an absolute gets a comparatively easy ride from the UK media, even in the last year, even post-disgrace, even post-payment, when he's sort of slowly crept back into the royal entourage at Sandringham on Christmas Day, or he's slowly crept back into the sort of public space. Was he allowed to wear a uniform? And Harry wasn't at one event. I could have misremembered that, or maybe they changed their mind at the last minute. But the idea that he gets an easier ride than his nephew, who has done nothing wrong, is extraordinary. And I'd like you to explain it to a mythical listener who's been asleep for 10 years. Angela is in Bracknell. Angela, what made you pick up the phone?
Because I've always liked Prince Harry, yes. And I do feel that he has been totally wronged by the British media. When he met Meghan, they made an extraordinary modern royal couple. She was portrayed as the golden girl at many events, and then bizarrely she was thrown to the wolves, and the public are force-fed on a daily basis nasty stories about mainly her, and unfortunately they meet the same opinion. And then you end up thinking that the egg is the chicken, don't you? You end up thinking that the negativity and the vitriol is justified by their behaviour. Exactly. I mean, for example, she chose to have her royal children in a different hospital, and she was absolutely crucified by that. It's her entitlement to choose where she wants to have her children. Another thing that really outraged me is the constant Piers Morgan criticism of her. And the Jeremy Clarkson, how his career survived after that article he wrote about her, that was nothing short of an absolute disgrace.
It was pretty grim, actually. I wrote about that.
Absolutely disgusting.
I wrote about that in my book, and I did that thing. It happened a few times writing the book, and where I just had to double check I remembered it correctly, because it was so gross what he wrote. I mean, it was absolutely breathtakingly disgusting. But of course, if you're on the right side, both the people you mentioned very much Rupert Murdoch creations, and therefore held to very, very different standards from the rest of the media firmament, I think. So the bit that possibly needs a little bit more exploration is the bit where the bond broke, where the media sort of changed direction or changed forces, and you think that's because they wanted to do things their own way. It would be that simple.
Well, it was really bizarre, because one minute she was signing bananas at a charity. She wrote a little message, I remember, on a banana at I think it may have been a woman's aid. She wrote little words of encouragement on bananas, and she was so praised at something so simple. But then all of a sudden it turned around, and anything and everything that poor woman did, she was annihilated.
Yes.
And it's almost like public figure number one, hated public figure number one, and they can't do anything. And yet you've got Andrew, who quite frankly should hang his head in shame and be sent to the tower.
These are figures of speech, of course. No, well, I mean, you do understand, but you don't understand. You're the same as me. I think we can probably assemble the jigsaw, but when we've assembled the jigsaw, we can't quite believe what we're looking at. We sort of go, well, how can that be? Just to make one example, BuzzFeed put together a wonderful selection of comparisons that I think if anybody honest were to read it properly, they'd have to abandon any opinion, even close to the one that Jason was sharing earlier. Here's the same newspaper, right? Both of these stories come from the Mail. And one is about Kate Middleton and one is about Meghan Markle, to use their maiden names. Not long to go, pregnant Kate tenderly cradles her baby bump while wrapping up her royal duties ahead of maternity leave. And William confirms she's due any minute now. So that's the Mail talking about Kate Middleton's baby bump during her pregnancy. Why can't Meghan Markle keep her hands off her bump? Experts tackle the question that has got the nation talking. Is it pride, vanity, acting, or a new age bonding technique? So there are two women doing exactly the same thing. They are cradling their baby bump. Okay? Two women doing two pregnant women in the royal family doing two pregnant women, both married to princes, doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same newspaper. One of them is tenderly cradling her baby bump, and one of them is posing the question that has got the nation talking. Is it pride, vanity, acting, or a new age bonding technique? And that's why the arguments, well, they shouldn't give so many interviews, or we shouldn't write books, or they shouldn't sign deals with Netflix, is so, forgive me, pathetic. They were doing that in 2019 in Meghan's case, and 9 months previously in Kate's. The same story. Two women from the same family doing the same thing, being reported in the same newspaper. And I wish I had some sort of ask the audience type device sometimes, like they have on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because, you can't hear me say that and cling to the view that you had before. If you were thinking, oh no, she's a wrong and no, it's rubbish, it's not media manipulation, it's all their own fault. No one's gaslit me. I'll arrive at my own conclusions. Thank you very much. You can't do that. You can't hear me. And that's only one example. I've got 5 more, 10 more, 20 more. But that is so direct, that comparison, that it beggars belief. Two women, both married to princes, in the same family, doing the same thing, reported in the same newspaper. One of them, pregnant Kate tenderly cradles her baby bump while wrapping up her royal duties ahead of maternity leave. The other one, why can't Meghan Markle keep her hands off her bump? Experts tackle the question that has got the nation talking. Is it pride, vanity, acting, or a new age bonding technique? Love to the family.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. All sorts of sort of reasons or theories on why Andrew Windsor would receive an easier ride from almost all of the British media than his nephew Prince Harry. But I guess the one that will resonate most is the simple suggestion that, well, they sort of refuse to dance to anybody else's tune. And maybe, you can criticise them for that. But when I show you stories like that one about the baby bump, I'm afraid you simply cannot sustain the position that they brought it on themselves. Here's another one. You ready? Kate's morning sickness cure. This is nice. 2 women, same family, both married to princes, both got morning sickness. No, I beg your pardon. Both. Well, I'll read you the story. Both in the Express, this one, which I think technically still qualifies as a newspaper. Kate's morning sickness cure, ? Prince William gifted with an avocado for pregnant Duchess. Isn't that lovely? So the story had been reported that Kate was suffering from morning sickness, and therefore a friendly member of the public who believed, I think it's an old wives' tale, that an avocado, well, I am probably the only person in England who still calls an avocado pear, an avocado would be a good cure for morning. Isn't that sweet? Meghan Markle, another headline, same newspaper. Meghan Markle's beloved avocado linked to human rights abuse and drought. Millennial shame. That's a story about avocados. One avocado has been linked to Kate Middleton. Kate's morning sickness cure. Prince William gifted with an avocado for pregnant Duchess. Another avocado is linked to Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle's beloved avocado linked to human rights abuse and drought. Millennial shame. And now tell me that they brought it on themselves by doing all those interviews. Imis Yalua is in Fulham. Hello.
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Good. Good to speak to you.
Likewise. What's going on?
Actually, just before I start, I wanted to say your tribute to Kate Garraway's husband was very lovely. You did
I wish it
very
wasn't
right.
necessary, but it's very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
I know. You did very right by your friend, and I know it's a really tough time to have to do stuff like this in this time, so well done to you.
Thank you.
That was my first thing. My second thing is, and you and I have had plenty of conversations on this topic, but I mean, the most obvious one is a nice little bit of racism and sexism. It's always nice to be reminded of the society in which we live. And I think if there's one thing that you can say that really kind of highlights that is the way that Andrew Windsor, I also love that he's no longer Prince Andrew on this show. I think that's
Not
great.
on this show. Although I'll
Andrew,
forget, you know how it works. I come up with these wizard wheezes. I've usually forgotten about them by 12:30. But I'll try. I'll say it. So it's disgraced former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Andrew Windsor. So there we go. 2024 has started well. Carry on.
How Andrew Windsor is portrayed and how Harry and Meghan have been portrayed. And I'm not always the biggest Harry and Meghan fan.
Sure.
I do think sometimes they've gone too far, but I do think that in this case, this man used £12 million of his mother's money. Let's also get that straight. He didn't have any. He had to go and ask his mother for it to pay a woman who said that he raped her. And I think that what it shows us is that what we're willing to allow people to let us forget. Because I was saying to your researcher, the reason that we remember Harry so much is because he's kind of pushed in our face.
Yes.
It's constant. It's like, they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and the nation's talking about it. People are like, oh, okay, well, the nation's talking about it, therefore it must be happening. But what you do forget is that somebody has actually written that headline.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily mean that the nation was talking about it before, but they're talking about it now.
And the other point, of course, which I've forgotten to mention is, I guess I've got a couple more of these examples that are truly breathtaking, the baby bump and the avocado so far. But the tradition would be for a quid pro quo. So I think Harry's big grievance, and he talks about this in the book, in Spare, his big grievance is that they felt that they were just being hung out to dry and that these stories were not being pushed back against. There was nothing in the palace machinery that was protecting them in the way that it would have protected his brother and his wife.
No, I definitely agree. Like, there was no protection for them. But I also think, like, you have to remember what Meghan represents. Like, she's a mixed race woman, and the reality is that the British media doesn't see her as that. They kind of follow the one drop rule. Like, she's black. Like, and it's so alien to what they think royalty should be. It doesn't make sense. You can't look at that and think, oh, following the tradition of hundreds and hundreds of years, this is what a royal should be. No, she's bucked the trend. She's different.
So
and
it was always doomed then. in a way.
It was always doomed. It was always doomed. Like, I remember when I heard it happened, I thought, why would you marry into this family? Why? Like, there's nothing about this family that makes you think that you, as the kind of woman you are, will be safe. They won't. No, they won't keep you safe. It's just not going to happen, and it's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate, and we're seeing it now that the rehabilitation of a potentially a sexual predator. He was at Sandringham walking up and down like nothing happened.
Yes, that's just true. And you know, as you say, potentially or accusations and allegations with that constant side order of millions of pounds being paid out to one of his accusers. He was clearly embarked upon a sort of slow creep back into the setup, wasn't he? And these latest revelations and the response from the palace. Who will not have been taken by surprise by the front pages today, that this is a sort of a parting of the ways, time to give Andrew the chop, no way back. That's the Sun and the Mail, the two sort of biggest players in this market, clearly are singing from the same hymn sheet, and it's over for him. But the planet on which Andrew's plight situation is in any way comparable to Harry's doesn't exist except on Fleet Street. You know, the idea that Harry will have garnered more negative headlines over the last 5 years than his uncle Andrew. It's breathtaking, and I'm sure you're right, Miss Yulua, the notion of her being such a violent rejection of royal history. You know, you cannot rise to the top of our society in this country if you are like her. You just can't. And whether that is racism or not is very much up to you. For me, it is. You know, it's because you justify the existence of the royal family by buying into some sort of notion of human hierarchy. And one of the most insidious examples of any notion of human hierarchy is race-based. So if you're buying into the notion of human hierarchy, and then someone comes along who, according to your other human hierarchy, should be inferior to you, how can she end up being a princess? There it is. And unfortunately, having worked with and on some of these newspapers, with some of the people who've risen subsequently to positions of power, they do think like that. They would, whether consciously or not, they would have a huge problem with the idea of a woman of colour being above them in the food chain. I will bend the knee to Charles and Camilla. I will bend the knee to William and Kate. I'm not bending any knee, metaphorical or otherwise, to some mixed-race woman from America. God forbid. Snobbery and race, class and race, absolutely inextricable in a lot of cases, and rarely more so than in this one. I've got another one for you, actually. Carol wins granny war. Gosh, that's an interesting story. What's it about? Duke and Duchess of Cambridge will spend second private Christmas with the Middleton family rather than joining the Queen at Sandringham. Oh, that's nice. William and Kate, plus their children, will spend Christmas with the Middletons. They will be with Kate's family at the family home near Bucklebury in Berkshire. That's nice. What would happen if Harry and Meghan decided not to spend Christmas at Sandringham with the royal family and instead, for example, perhaps spent it with her mum? Doesn't the Queen deserve better than this baffling festive absence? Richard Kay examines the impact of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's decision not to spend Christmas with the royal family. Two couples from the same family doing exactly the same thing, reported in the same newspaper. One of them, Carol wins the granny war. Oh, Duke and Duchess will spend private Christmas with Middleton family rather than joining Queen at Sandringham. The other one, doesn't the Queen deserve better? Richard Kay examines the impact of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's decision not to spend Christmas with the royal family. It's absolutely incredible.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The next conversation we're going to have is completely different. I have got a few more of these royal stories to share with you, these comparisons. They're breathtaking, right? And this story's been around. It was BuzzFeed that first went to the trouble of putting it together. And I don't think I've ever done a story like that. A journalist called Ellie Hall did it. And I bet she marvelled. It's 4 years old, almost to the day. I bet she was marvelling at what she was discovering. So someone would have said, is it worth trying to dig out some of the stories about Kate and Meghan and compare the two? And so she'd have started looking at them. She'd have started digging them out. And she'd have felt, oh, here's one about William and an avocado. I don't suppose they've ever written about Meghan and avocados. So Meghan Markle, avocado. But that's extraordinary. When Kate Middleton gets given an avocado, it's a touching example of deference to the royal family and a lovely cure for her morning sickness. When it's reported that Meghan Markle likes eating them, the Express runs an article about how they're linked to human rights abuses, drought and millennial shame. So it happens occasionally when you're doing a story from cuts. When you're doing I don't know why I talk knowledgeably like this. I haven't worked on newspapers for the best part of 25 years, apart from a very weird little period when I was the video games reviewer for the Daily Mail, would you believe? But you'll have to come to one of my events if you want to ask me more about that. And there are a couple coming up, actually. I have more details of that before 1 o'clock today. Oh, how do you contain your excitement at the moment? So you're doing a story from cuts. So you're going through cuts. And remember, when I was on newspapers, the internet was still in its infancy, so it was a lot harder. And you're looking for stories. So here's one about Kate cradling her baby bump. I don't suppose they've ever written about Meghan Markle cradling her baby bump. Oh, my days. Experts tackle the question that has got the nation talking. Is it pride, vanity, acting, or a new age bonding technique? Just extraordinary. Then they've got the Christmas trip. Here's a good one. Kate and Wills Incorporated. Duke and Duchess secretly set up companies to protect their brand, just like the Beckhams. Right? You got that? That's okay, right? Yeah? Kate and Wills Incorporated. Duke and Duchess secretly set up companies to protect their brand, just like the Beckhams. Oh, how nice. A right royal cash-in. How Prince Harry and Meghan Markle trademarked over 100 items, from hoodies to socks, 6 months before split with monarchy, with new empire worth up to £400 million. It's two couples from the same family, doing the same thing, being reported in the same newspaper, and one of them is reported in a way where you can almost feel the flecks of spittle emerging from the headline writer's mouth. And the other reads like a Mills and Boon. It is extraordinary. And I've got a couple more to share with you as well, but I'm not going to take any more calls on that. I want to move on to... Well, I need to set this up properly, actually, because it relies entirely on you. I have absolutely nothing to contribute to this conversation, except a rather unpleasant experience with mould that we had in our last house. If you do have mould, do get it seen to. I think it is probably going to be one of the big health stories of the next 10 years. I think the health impact of mould in homes, it's already started, hasn't it? I think there was a little boy who lost his life and the coroner thought that mould had played a part in that process. I think that the prevalence of mould, there's a variety of reasons why it's becoming more commonplace. The torrential nature of downpours these days, dampness, people blocking up ventilations to keep warm because heating is so expensive, and also irresponsible landlords, irresponsible rapacious landlords, more people living in rented accommodation, which is less likely to be kept spick and span than accommodation that is owned by the inhabitants, by the residents. But I think mould's going to be a big news. And that's my only little insight into this, is that we had mould years and years ago, and it was absolutely horrible. But that was not as a consequence of flooding. I don't know what it would be like to be flooded. But every time these stories come around, and they do now with unerring regularity, I don't know why, but I get the fear. I actually do conjure up the fear. Got burgled. I know what you're thinking. What's that got to do with being flooded? Well, the sense of violation when you're burgled. I think that we have quite a deep psychological relationship with our homes. I'm not expecting any prizes for that insight, but I'll just expand on it ever so slightly. I think subconsciously, home as sanctuary is absolutely intrinsic to our mental health. Even if you've got builders in, it can mess you up a bit. Even if when you go home and you close the door, you can't properly relax for whatever reason, whether you might have an incontinent dog, but you can't properly relax. I think that it chips away at your equilibrium in ways that are often not properly noticed. You're just going to become a bit more short-tempered and you don't know why. You're a bit more tired and you don't know why. That sense of the violation of solitude. It's not solitude, is it? Sanctuary. Sanctuary is the word I want. It's a nice juxtaposition of words, isn't it? The violation of sanctuary. Now, you get that with a burglary. It took us ages to overcome the psychological and the emotional, the mental impact of being burgled, because you don't relax. It robs you of relaxation. It robs you of the ability to relax. Every noise that you hear in the night, you're thinking they're back. You can't. I said to you some time ago that I wasn't sure that I'd ever slept as well after being burgled as I used to sleep before. That's a bit what's the word? Hyperbolical. Or hyperbolic. That's a bit hyperbolic. I prefer hyperbolical. Can I say no? Can I say hyperbolical? It's my show. I can say what I want. It's a bit hyperbolic, but that's how it felt. I mean, the burglary coincided fairly closely with the arrival of our first child. So it could have been that, because you're listening out. That's primeval, isn't it? That's primal. You go you're listening out for the baby's cry, so you never quite go into the depth of sleep that you went into before. But I did think that I never used to do this. You'd hear a little noise in the night, or a whisper of wind. I mean, not that kind of wind. You'd hear a whisper of wind in the night, and you'd think, oh, is there someone come in through the window downstairs, which is how we got burgled? Someone come in through the door. And I used to honestly think, it's a while since we've talked about this, but I used to honestly think that I had never slept as soundly as I did before. I do now. You'll be delighted to hear. I bought a silk mask some years ago, a silk sleep mask, because I like to sleep in absolute darkness. It's completely life-changing. If you've never tried that, or if you do suffer a bit from insomnia, or you find yourself waking up when you don't want to, do think about getting a sort of blindfold. It's not kinky or anything. It just makes you sleep in complete darkness. It's lovely. I suppose it could be kinky if you were a bit... No, all right, sorry. That's the closest I've got to being violated, all right? Not when I was wearing the blindfold, but when I was burgled. I can't imagine what being flooded would be like. I genuinely cannot imagine what being flooded would be like. So we've just had some work done lately, and I love it when you've just got a room that is 100 times nicer than it was before, and the idea of waking up, or to the slow knowledge that it was coming. There's one bloke in the paper today who's built a wall, like a proper wall. I live near the river. I live near canals and rivers, and particularly the Thames. One of my local pubs, actually, in Strand on the Green. I once looked up from having a pint, and there was a bloke canoeing past the window. That's how good the flood defences are on that pub. In Strand on the Green in Chiswick. They get flooded so often, but they're on a riverbank. They get flooded so often that they've built-in defences in such a way that the towpath gets flooded, and a bloke went past the window on the towpath in a canoe. And a lot of the houses on that stretch of river, and you've seen this where you are as well, a lot of this, they have like things that you can slot into grooves, like walls, flood defences. A bloke in the paper, I think he's in Gloucestershire, lives in the middle of a field. He's not on a riverbank, but he gets flooded so often that he's built a really watertight, there you go, I knew there was a word for it. He's built a watertight wall around his entire property, and it's worked this very week. It's about 4 inches below the top of the wall, and the water is everywhere. The whole area is waterlogged. Actually, come to think of it, how does he get out? You open the gate and it'd all come flooding in, wouldn't it? Maybe he's got a boat. I presume he has, of some sort. Maybe he works from home. I digress. The violation of being flooded, it almost haunts. I grew up near a town in Worcestershire called Bewdley, which would get flooded more regular. It was newsworthy. Bewdley was newsworthy because of how often it got flooded. Now, you get weather like we've had in the last couple of weeks. Storm Henk, it's called, isn't it, this week? And getting flooded seems... In fact, even as I speak, I turn to my left, and there is footage of a street in Nottinghamshire that looks like a canal in Venice. It literally looks like Venice. It is commonplace. It is spreading. It is happening more and more and more. I'm interested in why that is, although I suspect that the answers are fairly obvious. The weather would be the most obvious. The lack of drainage would be the other. The paving over of grassland and front gardens. All of these things play a part. And gully suckers probably have a role to play. The decline of the gully sucker. It's the title of my next book. The decline of the gully sucker probably has a part to play as well. But I want to talk about the human aspect of it. I want you to tell me very simply. Sometimes I ask you quite complicated questions on this programme. Sometimes I ask you incredibly simple ones, and they rarely get simpler than this. What's it like to be flooded? What happens when you get flooded? Where do you sleep on the first night? How does it... I mean, I'm fascinated by safety nets. I think my politics are defined by safety nets, actually. The importance of having safety nets in place, for me, describes the difference between someone who's loosely left-wing and someone who's loosely right-wing. Someone who's loosely right-wing, in the modern iteration, doesn't believe in safety nets because they don't need them. I don't need a safety net. I've got a holiday home. If my house gets flooded, I'll go there. I don't need a safety net. If you haven't got another place to go to, if your home gets flooded, you need to get a better job. You haven't worked hard enough. So food banks are safety nets. The welfare state is a safety net. The NHS is a safety net. All of the things that a certain type of Tory hates or denies the necessity of, they're all safety nets. What is the safety net when you get flooded? What actually happens? Where do you go? How does it... who do you turn to? Who do you ring? Where do you sleep if you haven't got family or friends? What is the escape route? How do you get into the safety? I know nothing about this. How awful is it to be flooded? And for people who don't have personal experience of it, why is it happening so much now? Building on floodplains would be part of the answer, but some of these houses have been around for ages and didn't get flooded before. So what happens when your home gets flooded? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I have enormous, I do, absolutely epic sympathy for you. But I do want to know what it's like. If you're caught up in the middle of it right now, you're probably far too harried and busy to ring in. But do feel free to do so. If you've been through it in the past, straight to the front of the queue. What happens when your home gets flooded? Because I want to talk about this story from the human angle rather than the news angle. They love sending out the cameras. The TV companies love sending out the cameras to film the streets that look like canals, and you get the stories of sports halls full of people, but they're a little bit faceless. Even when you get a vox pop on, even when you get a case study, the brushstrokes are very broad. Every experience of flooding will be different. Everybody's got a home. Well, almost everybody. And there is something intrinsic to our mental well-being about the security, the sanctuary of our home. Flooding must rob you of that in a way that I don't think anyone can fully understand unless they've been through it. So give me a call and tell me what it's like. 0345 6060 973. It's 12:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 19 minutes after 12, and it is one of those things. I think I do put it on the same page as being burgled. It's one of those things that you can be haunted by. But if your home is liable to being flooded, it must be happening time and time again. What's it like? What happens when a flood kicks in? I turn to my right, and it is now that the TV cameras have turned up hundreds of homes flooded in England after powerful storm and heavy rainfall. This didn't happen when we were kids, unless you lived in Bewdley. I appreciate that growing up in Kidderminster makes Bewdley particularly pertinent, and that you grew up somewhere else, there'd be a local place where... But you always knew the bits that got flooded, right? And now it seems that it can happen absolutely anywhere. Do we know why? But more interestingly for me, what's it like? Tony's in Taunton. Tony, what can you tell us?
Hello, James.
Hello,
don't know if you remember 2014.
Well, vaguely, yeah. It was only 10 years ago. What about it in particular?
Somerset. We had 77
yes.
days of rain.
Yes.
And we had what eventually became known as Lake Patterson, 72 square kilometres of land flooded.
Which would previously have been, what, farmland or residential, everything?
Most of farmland, but there were quite a bit of residential, a lot of villages, small hamlets, major roads, railway lines, everything covered by water.
Extraordinary.
And I heard a message out on the TV one evening, and there was some localist who was saying, we need help. Nobody seems to be helping us. What is it? Can anybody help?
Really?
So, yeah.
So it is a little bit Wild West. I mean, I know insurers have a role to play and the council has a role to play, but it is perfectly possible to feel as if you've just as if you're just on your own.
Oh, absolutely. And these people definitely did, because I went down the next day, and next thing you know, I've been involved in doing a number of things, helping clear out houses, helping people move around, and I'm still working there a year later.
Just out of the goodness of your heart?
Yeah.
Oh,
we weren't getting paid for it. Basically, it was whatever people needed. There was one hamlet.
What was the worst thing you saw? What was the worst thing you saw? Because I'm thinking about the smell. Gary used to work for a building company dealing with flooded homes. He says the smell, the damage, the discomfort is something I won't forget in a hurry. What
there were houses there that had been underwater for 3 months. And I went round with 3 ladies, and we were collecting all the white goods, all the fridge freezers. I had to empty everything out, double bag it, take it off down to the tip.
Putrid.
And then, absolutely everything disgusting. And
where were they living?
Weird.
Where did those people live for 3 months? Do you know?
Anywhere they could get. I mean, some of them were living in rented accommodation. Some of them found caravans. I mean, literally, we had families living in a caravan designed for 2 people.
And it goes on.
It was, and I mean, there was one lady in particular said to me, she heard the rain rattling on the roof of the conservatory, and all of a sudden, that was it. Right, what do I need to do? Do I need to start moving things? Do I need to start preparing? And it really was anxiety. It was, you could see this, and it was still happening. That's the bit.
That's the bit that's going to be hard to communicate, and you know, you doing the right thing and helping out, but only getting, as you say, as a spectator really of the trauma, as opposed to someone actually suffering from it. I can't. That's the bit that intrigues me. That sense of powerlessness twinned with rootlessness. They've taken it's almost like they've cut your roots, isn't it? Pete knows what I'm talking about. He says, we live on a boat in Tewkesbury. Now, my immediate thick response to this, Pete, I have to be honest, is, well, if you live on a boat, you should be fine. I don't know whether you'd call it the Noah principle, but presumably if the place where you keep the boat gets flooded, then you can't get to the boat. You can't get on it. I don't know. But if you, like a canal boat, you park it, you moor it. You can't just float around on the floodwater until you get to a place. So I think I understand why living on a boat is not actually, despite what the Bible teaches us, the best way to deal with a flood. We haven't been able to get home for over a week now. It absolutely grinds you down. I bet it does, mate. We're staying in various friends' places, including in a van on a friend's drive on New Year's Eve. We don't know day by day where we're going to be each night, but hey, there's nothing we can do. And that's the killer thing about it. It is literally an act of nature, isn't it? Jen's in Attleborough in Norfolk. It's one stop before Wyndham.
It is, James. Yes, it is.
Look at that Norfolk knowledge, Jen. What would you like to say?
First of all, it's so lovely to speak to you.
Likewise, thank you.
My scenario is slightly different. I was away on holiday for a week in the sun, came home, opened my front door to find that there was water pouring from my ceilings because it wasn't a burst pipe, it was a tiny pinhole prick in the cold feeder pipe to the tap in the bathroom upstairs. So everything was ruined. And I think that the reason why I called is because I'd never experienced anything like this before. So I had no idea about the psychological effect that this would have on me. And I was very, very upset to the point that even 3 weeks later, when I was talking to people about it, my bottom lip was still going. And it was almost like I was in grief.
It's trauma.
It is trauma. And, you know, I'm fine. I'm back in my house now. I only had to spend 5 weeks away from my house. But the interesting thing as well is, unless you've actually experienced it, you can't feel what it's like, because I did feel violated, just like you said.
Yeah.
And although I was telling friends and family, you know, this has happened, and I was showing them pictures, it wasn't until people came into the house and looked and saw and went, oh, my God, this is far worse than I could ever possibly have imagined. And I went away at Christmas, and when I came back, I opened my door and I started to cry.
Oh, I bet you did.
Because everything was fine in the house.
So you're coming back to that sense of peace that had been taken away from you.
Yeah.
And you were insured, I presume?
I was, and they've been absolutely fantastic, I have to say.
So what did they do? They put you in a hotel the first night, or?
Well, I lived upstairs until December. So from August to December, I lived upstairs. It's like being a student again. I was eating and working on my bed. But when the building work was being done, I did move out.
Right.
And I'm now back in, but it's still not straight. I think when I said to people I'm back in the house, they think that everything's back to normal, but it's not.
In what way?
I've got no furniture downstairs. The carpet and everything is down, but that means I'm still living in my bedroom until my sofas turn up.
So you've got to start from scratch in a sense, haven't you?
Yes. But the insurance company has been absolutely fantastic.
Well, that's good to hear. That's very good to hear. And finally, do you notice yourself responding now if you hear a drip or you hear?
Well, I mean,
sorry, I don't want to trigger you.
No, it's okay. About 4 weeks ago, just before Christmas, there was heavy rain and flooding in Attleborough, and it's a very different type of experience though, because they've actually got water, a foot, 2 feet high in their houses, and I do feel very differently about it now. Yes, and my experience, although it was hard, it was short-lived, and it's nearly over. But for those people that live the people experiencing that today, it must be absolutely dreadful for them, and my heart goes out to them.
It must be, mustn't it? Was I was from Wyndham, wasn't he? Not from Attleborough, Ket.
I don't know. I'm Newton.
No, come on. What's his name? The Ket's Rebellion. What was his first name? Was it Robert?
Yes, it was. Yes, that's right. Yes, Ket. Sorry, I thought you were talking about somebody today. Yes,
no, I'm fascinated by Ket's Rebellion because it's 1540 something, and one of those things that doesn't really get taught in schools, or didn't, because it gives the plebs the idea that they might actually be able to overthrow royalty. But I think he was from Wyndham, wasn't he? He was just up the road from you.
Yes, I'm in education, and I'm in education, and it does get talked about.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear more of that sort of thing. Thank you, Jen. You've covered a lot of topics there that you weren't expecting to. Robert Ket. There's an oak on Mouseld Heath. I love Norwich. I know it all sounds a bit partridgey, but I love that part of the world. 27. And when you get into North Norfolk, which I know quite well, the relationship between the communities and the water is intimate in the same way that you get in sort of riverside or canal side. So obviously you get coastal as well. Lucy's in Saffron Walden. Lucy, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Lovely to talk to you.
Likewise.
I don't know, when I heard you talking about this morning, it kind of, well, it's been with me for a year, but it kind of, it's cathartic to talk about things.
I'm sure.
And it can be. So 2 weeks before Christmas last year, we were upstairs. I was upstairs. Both my children are high-level autism and ADHD. And we were upstairs showering out, which can take a while.
Yes,
and my son had finished, and he went downstairs and he said, "Mum, I can see poo on the floor." Mm. So I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, and water." So I went down the stairs, and we were completely flooded up to 3 steps up. He didn't explain it very well.
No.
With sewage, the whole ground floor of the house, and it was, we'd not heard anything. All we'd done is have a shower.
Good Lord.
And now there was local flooding, and it was on our survey when we bought the house. We'd not been in 6 months.
Right.
That we were likely we could flood, but honestly, we're on a hill. It's like, oh, really?
Yeah.
So anyway, it turns out the main drains were totally overflowed and full on this fairly new estate.
Right.
And we didn't know that underground, 6 foot down in our manholes, our piping had been built incorrectly by a very well-known builder who's didn't want to help us.
No, I hear a lot about that on new builds. Actually, there's been astonishing bit of some of the documentaries and stuff like that. So you said what happened? It exploded effectively.
Our downstairs toilet exploded.
What, literally? You mean it turned into a fountain, or the actual ceramics?
Turned into a fountain and cracked apart. And my husband was outside, and he come in, and he just totally I've never seen his face like it. And he phoned the insurance company straight away, who were an online insurance company who he bitterly regretted going with.
Right.
Because, long story short, after 2 weeks, we still had feces floating around.
No, stop saying that. Don't stop saying it's important. We got to.
Last time, because you can see it now. But we lost everything, of course, sofas, dining tables, furniture, every single thing. It was in every cupboard, it was in everything, but school bags, school shoes, ironing board, all the small things that you wouldn't even contemplate.
You wouldn't notice that you even had them until you didn't, to paraphrase Joni Mitchell.
I've had that 5 years, and it's gone. And piano, silly things like the piano was stored in the cupboard, like a big keyboard. Lost, everything.
All gone.
So we decided to clean it ourselves because the insurance company said that they weren't going to come out. because of how busy they were with flooding everywhere, which is fair enough. So we bought a machine, did it ourselves, and the children moved out for 7 weeks and had to live elsewhere with family due to their medical conditions. We lived upstairs, and then we had to have dehumidifiers for 6 weeks with our heating on 26 degrees. Had to be
to get everything out. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, otherwise
we
get the mould. We get the mould that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So they had to come out and test it. After 7 weeks, it still wasn't dry. As it right down into the concrete, and then we had some more weeks, and then it was dry. So great, new flooring, blah blah blah. But only 2 days ago, I managed to fight with the NHBC to get the drainage people to come out, and they've just dug up 2 days ago my whole garden, gone down 6-7 foot, took out all the pipes, which were all incorrectly built, and replaced it all. And so as of 2 days ago,
fingers crossed it's not going to
over.
happen. It's not going to happen again.
No, but you know
what you remind us of, I'm late for the news actually, so I've got to crack on, Lucy, but we're watching this and you think, well, when the water goes down, everything gets back to, when the water goes away, that's when the really nasty business starts. That's when the really hard work starts. 12:32, Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Lucy Easthope's book, When the Dust Settles, is strong on this as well, on flooding. I think it was Doncaster, the example that she used. Lucy Easthope's book's brilliant generally. If you didn't listen to her Full Disclosure podcast with me last year, then you really should do so. But if you can't be bothered to do that, if you've had enough of my voice, for example, then just read her book. It's an extraordinary sort of disaster response is the official title, but you quickly discover it means so much more than that. It is quite extraordinary, and she's brilliant on Twitter as well. She's called Lucy Go Bags on Twitter, because a go bag is the thing you grab when you're running out of the house to respond to a disaster, I presume. The question of flooding being a really, really good example of that. We're back to it in a minute. No prizes for anyone who's texted in to say the calls are really flooding in, James. Yeah. But another example, perhaps, probably my favourite example of the utter double standards deployed when it comes to reporting on the royal family. In this case, the difference between Kate and William and Harry and Meghan. This is probably my favourite example because it's so blatant and so grim. Here is a story about Kate Middleton's wedding bouquet. A floral code popular in Victorian times is making a comeback thanks to our royal newlyweds, says author Vanessa Diffenbaugh. And part of that floral bouquet, which is making a comeback, was a certain type of flower, which also appeared in Meghan Markle's wedding bouquet. And that flower was I think it was a lilac, was it? No, hang on. Lily of the Valley, okay? So it appeared in both bouquets. It was Lily of the Valley in Kate Middleton's. Why you can always say it with flowers. A floral code popular in Victorian times is making a comeback thanks to our royal newlyweds, says author Vanessa Diffenbaugh. That includes Lily of the Valley. And then in Meghan's bouquet, this is, when I say favourite, I mean the best example. Royal wedding, how Meghan Markle's flowers may have put Prince Charlotte's life at risk. So this is the same flower in the wedding bouquet of two women from the same family being reported in the same newspaper, but not in the same way. So Meghan Markle married Prince Harry in a stunning ceremony watched by millions, but an element of their nuptials may have put their bridesmaids, including Princess Charlotte's, lives at risk. Versus, a floral code popular in Victorian times is making a comeback thanks to our royal newlyweds. So there you have it. This is why any attempt to say, oh no, they brought it on themselves. Well, they shouldn't have given so many interviews. They shouldn't have written about it. They're all ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But people don't realise because they've been gaslit. And that's what gaslit means. You don't realise you've been gaslit. You think it really is getting darker. 12:39 is the time. Paul's in Wolverley, which is just up the road from Kidderminster. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hi. I've lived through a flood event, or three. And
Bewdley, was it?
In Bewdley.
Yeah, there you go. Has to be. You'd be all right in Wolverley. You're quite high up, aren't you?
We live on a hill now, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we we bought our house in Bewdley in 2012, and it's one of the oldest houses in the town. And it hadn't flooded in a generation. Gosh. It hadn't flooded in a very long time. And we bought it safe in the knowledge that there were at least temporary flood defences right outside our house. And it hadn't flooded, and we had sort of 8 happy years there, flood-free. Right. And then 2020 hit. Gosh. And they had record river levels, and we flooded spectacularly.
What's it like?
It's the reason why I wanted to call in, really. I don't think people realise the effect it has on your mental health.
That's what I'm interested in.
And it was tough. It was tough. You're living through like almost an action movie, if that's the right thing. It's like surreal. It's not real. In 2020, in early 2020, it was just before lockdown. It was just before the first lockdown, and we flooded. We lost a lot. And
where did you go on the night? What happened? I mean, what happened when you realised? Did you stay upstairs, or was it uninhabitable? What did you do?
I tell you what, my daughter was cooking pancakes,
right,
and there was a knock on the window, and it was Sarah Rescue, who do a brilliant work. They're a voluntary, like an emergency services when it floods. Gosh. They knocked on the window and said, "You need to evacuate. You're going to flood," because over the years the river levels do come high. Sure. But you just think, this isn't going to be a flood event, but on this night it was. So we evacuated, and we went to some friends just around the corner. Very helpful. We woke up in the morning and we saw that the river had completely gone through the house. And
Were you by the river?
We were right on the river.
So near the merchant's house then?
Close by.
Near the chippy.
Merchant's house.
Yeah. I'm just showing
on the other side of the river.
Oh, were you? So near the Black Boy. Near the Black Boy then?
Near the Black Boy, that was my regular.
Yeah, I love the Black. Get a nice pint of Bathams in the Black Boy. Did you know that you were speaking to a Kidderminster lad when you rang in?
Yeah,
I do. I thought you might. And I just like to show off my local knowledge. I've done Norfolk and now I'm doing Worcestershire, so I know exactly where you are.
I did meet you in Bewdley in October.
There you go.
I came to see you.
Well, thank you.
We had a great night together.
It was a good night, wasn't it? I think I'm coming back. I'll let you know. So, So you're out. You've got friends that you can move in with, but that sense of most problems, you know where the end is, don't you? You sort of think, well, if I do this and I do that, then everything will be back to normal. This is the kind of problem where you're wondering immediately whether are we ever going to get back to normal? What is normal?
That's right. And during this time, we flooded. We were campaigning as a not me, but there was a group of Bewdley flood resident associations campaigning to get flood defences built, permanent ones, because on the other side of the town you've got permanent flood defences, while on the other side they were temporary.
I didn't know that.
And in the second year, the second flood event, we went into lockdown with a flooded home. We had to move to temporary accommodation with 4 children, and it was difficult.
I bet it was.
But it was more difficult to get any work done in lockdown anyway.
Yeah.
And we weren't allowed out of the house unless we had to go back there. It was the first lockdown, and then almost a year to the day, James, we flooded again for a second time.
Oh no!
So all the work, the restoration work that we did, got soaked again. It was very difficult, and it does have an effect on your mental health. You just think the second time, the temporary flood barriers, James, they failed. They actually parted like a sardine cap. Millions of tons of water just came into our street like a tsunami. And this isn't reported on at the time very much at all.
Well, the spotlight moves, doesn't it? That's the problem. It feels like it is the most important thing that could happen in your world. But from the point of view of someone sitting in London or Birmingham deciding on what to put on the news tonight, it doesn't always translate. Right. And was that a big decision behind moving to Wolverley?
Oh, most definitely. Yeah. I mean, we love Bewdley, we love where we were living, but we were lucky enough to sell the house. And my heart does go out to that community there, and the community spirit, James. When you flood, you might not know all of your neighbours, but by the end of a flood event, you do.
I mean, it's not much of a silver lining, but I understand precisely the point that you're making. And I guess, look, you're ahead of the curve. It's not much fun to be, but moving forward, things like permanent flood defences, even quite far inland, but riverside places like Bewdley are gonna have to be a lot more commonplace. I remember what it used to be like on the other side of the river before they'd put them in. I'd forgotten they'd put permanent ones in there. Final question, Paul.
Yeah.
What's your local now? Is it the Lock or the Queen's Head?
The Queen's Head.
There it is.
My daughter works there now as a barmaid.
Fantastic. So you get a staff discount when nobody's looking. Paul, thank you, mate. You take care. And I'll see you again, I hope. Next time I'm on the road. 12:45 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue the conversation about what it's like to be flooded. We haven't talked about Gaza today, but we have touched on, we talked about it at length yesterday, this notion of, it's a tension, isn't it? It's a really tricky tension for anyone who wants to marry a profound and deep belief in the essential existence of the modern state of Israel, coupled with a deep, deep understanding of the generational trauma and the constant existential threat, with a profound conviction that what is currently going on in Gaza is indefensible and disgusting. The difficulty of trying to, or even being allowed to sustain all three of those positions is something that I probably would have explored on the programme today if we hadn't done 2 hours on it yesterday. But yesterday we were talking about the words of the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zippy Hovely, and one caller, I think, with a better grasp of Israeli politics than I have, suggested that, I mean, it was a bit mealy-mouthed with respect, but because he was sort of saying she doesn't really speak for the government, and of course the job of an ambassador is literally to represent a government in a foreign territory. But he did make a couple of comments speaking about the nature of the domestic political debate, and I have to tell you that an MP in Israel called Tali Gottlieb someone's just sent me this footage, has said that without hunger and thirst among the Gazan population, we will not be able to recruit collaborators, recruit intelligence, bribe people with food, drink and medicine in order to obtain intelligence. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's a competition, but every time you think you've heard something, every time you think that the rhetoric coming out of some of the politicians involved in this tragedy, this catastrophe, this atrocity, everything, you think it can't get any worse. It can. There's a Liquid MP, I think, called Moshe Sada. It is clear that all the Gazans need to be destroyed. Deputy Speaker, another member of Likud, Nissim Vaturi, said Israel had to no less than burn Gaza. Who's left in Gaza? Are there citizens? There are only tunnels, Hamas and accursed terrorists. We have to crush Gaza. Gaza is Hamas. I still think that the British audience, the British consumer of news, is really being denied an awful lot of the detail and indeed evidence that lies behind the conviction that what's happening now is indefensible. But the difficulty of sustaining that view while also espousing a deep conviction and support for the modern state of Israel is something that we'll definitely get stuck into next week. So, I mean, traumatic territory that we're exploring together, but not as traumatic as the situation in the Middle East. I suppose, in a sense, that this is like the entry-level experience. The closest many of us would ever get to knowing what it's like to have your house destroyed would be to be the victim of flooding, actually. And you've heard the testimony today of people, the impact upon mental health, the sort of hypervigilance that kicks in, a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's for people in full knowledge that they're going to be able to go back to their home and that the insurance company's probably going to pay out and that everything's going to be all right. So God knows what it would be like to go through what many people in that part of the world are going through. But I steer you back to domestic matters and indeed floods, and just wondering what it's like in that first instance, and then even more so as the conversation has progressed in the aftermath. 12:52 is the time. Vicky is in Neath in Wales. Vicky, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So it's just really interesting. I got flooded in 2018 for the first time.
Right.
And it wasn't bad. It was bad. It was like up to our ankles the first time.
Yes.
We got over that. My landlord had all our flooring done. We had just got back on our feet. And then again, the beginning of lockdown, 2 years later, we flooded again. This time it was up to my waist. In the living room at 3 o'clock in the morning.
That's horrible. So I'm thinking, I don't know why, but I'm thinking about plug sockets. If it's up to your ankles, it's not reached the plug sockets. If it's up to your waist, the plug sockets are their history.
Exactly.
They're longer. Oh, you poor thing.
Yeah. And I had 2 young kids at the time as well.
Well, I hope you still do.
Yeah,
that's a relief.
They're not young anymore.
No, I suppose that's the way it works, isn't it? Yes.
But, yeah, I just wanted to mention some of the ways that I coped through the flooding. Yes. Like, one of the things that I found was I didn't have control of the situation, and I've got OCD, and not being able to control what was happening in my life at the time, it was horrendous for me.
I can imagine.
And I started running. And that was the only thing that I felt like I had a control of was, right, if I can't do this in my house today, if I can't fix this, or something's not going right again in the way of council letting us down, or people saying that they were going to help and not helping, I'm just going to go and do my run. And that's the one thing that I can control in my life. Okay. And that, for me, saved me. Like when, you mentioned PTSD just now. And when my doctor told me I had PTSD, I thought, don't be so silly. Because
I've just been flooded. I haven't been to Afghanistan. I've just had a flood situation. No, I get it, though. I can understand why it would be
and that was the only thing that kind of helped me through.
Gosh, that's fascinating. And have you stuck at it? Are you still a runner?
Yeah, I've done 2 marathons since then.
So it's life-changing now. This is quite a big silver lining, isn't it?
I've lost 5 stone. Everything completely changed, yeah.
And is the house back to normal? Is everything back to normal?
It is back to normal, but I moved away.
Did you?
So, yeah, unfortunately, we didn't have insurance because after the first time, it was too high. I couldn't pay it. There's a cost of living crisis.
So they ramped, after the first claim, they ramped up the premium so much that you couldn't afford to... Oh, you poor thing.
And not just that, though. When you think that you're insured and you go places... So, for example, a silly thing, I went to Curry's because they told me that my oven and my fridge were insured.
Yes.
I got there and they're like, it's not covered for storm damage.
No.
So even when you think some things are insured, they're not as well. God. And then, of course, that premium went ridiculously high. I couldn't pay it. Christmas had just been. It was February. We lost absolutely everything. It was 2 bedrooms upstairs and living room, kitchen, bathroom downstairs. And we lost everything apart from our bedrooms. It was just horrendous.
That is yeah. And then you have to, almost literally start from scratch with a lot less of the money that you thought you were going to have. Especially the second time was utterly destructive.
Yeah.
So now you're out of an area, so you're not going to get flooded.
I'm round the corner up a hill.
I thought you were going to say, I've moved it to the 17th floor, James. I live in a tower block. That'd be the temptation.
My best friends, they still live there. Like where we lived as well, we were in front of a canal.
Right.
So it's a beautiful area. And some people, some of them were in their 60s. They couldn't afford to remortgage and move or anything like that. So a lot of people are still there. And every time it rains, I'm like, oh no.
Oh, yeah, well, that's hypervigilance. That's another thing that is sort of linked to trauma. And even I'm no expert in any of these fields, but and post-traumatic stress disorders. That sense of hypervigilance, that fight or flight adrenaline, is only supposed to come in on emergencies. But you have experiences that mean it's almost a constant presence. Thank you, Vicky. That was a lovely story, actually, albeit with such a grim beginning. And the power of running as an antidote to lack of control is something that I certainly think about. Lots of other people have been pleased to hear that. It is one of those things, if you've not been through it, you can't quite get it, isn't it? Every caller is almost as if you need a translate. You just need an extra gear of language. You can't quite convey how utterly awful it is. You can describe it, but you can't quite convey it. Brenda is in Biggleswade with the last word on this. Brenda, what's it going to be?
Thank you, James.
Hello.
I'm a bit nervous.
It's only me. It's only me.
Before lockdown, we had a new dishwasher put in on Christmas Eve in the kitchen. Everything's fine. Come Easter, so you're talking 3 to 4 months, came down one morning and we thought one of the cats had an accident in the dining room and looked and thought, what on earth is that?
Yeah.
checked, and it was coming through the wooden floor, just little bits every now and then.
What, from below? Coming from below, coming up through the floor?
From below,
Uh-oh.
yeah. Kitchen was fine.
Right.
No smell of damp. Checked under the, under the sink, nothing. So wiped it up, thought it was spillage. This went on for 2 or 3 days. To cut a long story short, there had been a drip from where the installation had been done wrong.
Right.
And it had gone, because the kitchen floor had been surrounded properly, it was a good hard kitchen slate floor, it had gone all the way round. And this is what frightens me now, and I think a lot of people don't realise how invasive water is. And it ended up that we had to have the dining room, the living room, the hall. It was coming from under the stairs, and it had just gone everywhere. And when we took the floorboards up, it was dark green mould with spores.
And we're going to run out of time, but even when it's fixed, you're still in that place, aren't you?
I am still there. If I smell anything now that is slightly damp or see a drip of water
full-on
on the
panic
floor,
stations.
it hits the stomach. So people you have to have respect for water.
There you go. I love that. Thank you, Brad. I love the way you're thinking about others as well, even as you detail your own unpleasant experience. You do. Yeah, I mean, you really do. If you meet, crikey, is it that time already? Sometimes Sheila Fogarty floats into the room and I think she's early. I think she's taken a wrong turn.
No, you're late.
Sorry.
You're not actually.
I am. I'm about to be. I am now. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. All of LBC's shows are there to catch up on, as well as all the best video clips from LBC and other global stations. Please pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. You can download it for free from your app store or just head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.